Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, we set aside the noise of the present and wander gently into the stories of the past. Whether you're curled up beneath the blankets, resting after a long day, or simply seeking calm company for your evening, I'm grateful you've chosen to be here. If you'd like, share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far this community stretches across time zones and continents. And if these soothing journeys through history bring you comfort, consider subscribing so we can meet again. For now, let's loosen the weight of the modern world and step softly into the echoes of yesterday. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the mists of time, to a world where the line between dream and reality was as thin as morning fog over the Aegean Sea. Tonight, we journey together into the unfolding story of how a collection of distant colonies, clinging to the edge of a vast and unknown continent, transformed itself across centuries into the most powerful nation the modern world has ever known. This is not a tale of inevitable triumph or manifest destiny, but rather a complex tapestry woven from ambition and accident, vision and violence, innovation and contradiction. It is a story that begins not with thunder and conquest, but with quiet desperation, with ships crossing dark waters, carrying people fleeing persecution, seeking fortune, or bound in chains against their will. Picture, if you will, the eastern seaboard of North America in the early 17th century. The land stretches endlessly westward, covered in forests so dense that sunlight barely touches the ground beneath the canopy. Rivers flow like silver ribbons through valleys that have known only the footsteps of indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The air is clean and sharp, filled with the calls of birds that Europeans have never seen, the rustle of creatures moving through undergrowth, the whisper of wind through trees that have stood for centuries. This is a world complete unto itself, with its own rhythms, its own nations, its own long and intricate history that stretches back beyond memory. Into this world come wooden ships, their sails patched and salt-stained, their holds cramped and reeking. The first permanent English settlement at Jamestown in 1607 is less a bold stride into a new world than a desperate gamble by men who have no idea how to survive in this strange land. They are gentlemen adventurers and craftsmen, soldiers and laborers, expecting to find gold as the Spanish had in Mexico and Peru, expecting indigenous peoples to serve them as they served Spanish masters further south. What they find instead is a land that will not yield its secrets easily, that demands adaptation and humility, that will kill more than half of them in the first year through starvation, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan people whose territory they have invaded. The story of Jamestown is one of suffering and stubbornness in equal measure. The colonists, many of them unused to physical labor, spend their first months searching for gold that does not exist while their food supplies dwindle. They build their fort in a swampy area where mosquitoes breed disease, where the water is brackish and undrinkable. The gentlemen among them refuse to work with their hands, considering it beneath their station, while those willing to labor grow weak from hunger. The winter of 1609 to 1610 becomes known as the starving time, when the settlement's population drops from 500 to 60, when survivors resort to eating rats, shoe leather, and, according to some accounts, even the bodies of the dead. The colony survives not through its own virtue but through a combination of desperate adaptation and continued support from England. When Captain John Smith takes control, he institutes a simple rule: those who do not work do not eat, forcing even the gentlemen to pick up shovels and axes. The colonists begin learning from the Powhatan how to grow corn, how to identify which plants are edible and which are poison, how to navigate the rivers and forests that surround them. They develop a new crop that will transform their fortunes: tobacco, a plant indigenous to the Americas, which creates an insatiable demand in Europe despite King James's vigorous condemnation of smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. The cultivation of tobacco changes everything. It transforms Virginia from a dying venture into a profitable enterprise, but it also establishes patterns that will shape American history for centuries to come. Tobacco requires intensive labor, and the Virginia Company begins importing indentured servants from England, poor people who agree to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World. But indentured servants eventually gain their freedom, and their labor is insufficient for the growing tobacco plantations. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrive in Virginia, brought by a Dutch ship, marking the beginning of American slavery's long and terrible chapter. What starts as a trickle will become a flood, as the economic logic of plantation agriculture drives the colonies toward an institution that will eventually require a civil war to destroy. Meanwhile, further north, a very different kind of colony takes root. In 1620, the ship Mayflower deposits a group of English separatists, religious dissenters fleeing persecution, on the cold shores of Massachusetts. These are the people history will call Pilgrims, and their settlement at Plymouth represents a different vision for the New World. Where Jamestown was founded by a commercial company seeking profit, Plymouth is established by families seeking religious freedom, the right to worship God according to their own conscience rather than the dictates of the Church of England. The Pilgrims' first winter is even more brutal than Jamestown's starving time. They arrive in November, too late to plant crops, with insufficient supplies and no knowledge of how to survive in this harsh climate. By spring, half of them are dead, buried in unmarked graves that they level with the ground so the indigenous people will not know how weak they have become. The survival of the rest depends entirely on the assistance of the Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Squanto who had been kidnapped by English traders years before, taken to Europe, and miraculously found his way back to his homeland only to discover his entire village wiped out by disease. Squanto teaches the Pilgrims how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, how to tap maple trees for syrup, how to identify edible plants and avoid poisonous ones. He serves as interpreter and intermediary with Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader who agrees to a treaty of mutual defense with the struggling English settlement. The famous Thanksgiving feast of 1621, when Pilgrims and Wampanoag share a harvest meal, is both a genuine moment of cross-cultural cooperation and the beginning of a tragic story. The peace will not last a full generation before war erupts, before the expanding English settlements push the indigenous peoples toward dispossession and destruction. As the 17th century unfolds, more colonies appear along the coast, each with its own character and purpose. Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded in 1630 by Puritans seeking to create a city upon a hill that would serve as a model of godly society, quickly becomes the most populous and influential of the northern settlements. The Puritans arrive not as desperate adventurers but as organized communities with resources, skills, and a clear vision of the society they wish to build. Within a decade, more than 20,000 of them cross the Atlantic in what becomes known as the Great Migration, establishing towns throughout New England, founding Harvard College to train ministers, creating a society where church and state are intimately intertwined. The Puritan experiment is marked by intense religious zeal, democratic town meetings, and a disturbing intolerance for dissent. When Roger Williams challenges the colony's authority to take Native American land without purchase and advocates for separation of church and state, he is banished and flees south to found Rhode Island as a haven for religious liberty. When Anne Hutchinson holds prayer meetings in her home and preaches that divine grace rather than good works determines salvation, she is tried for heresy and also banished. The Puritans' desire for religious freedom applies only to themselves, not to those who disagree with their interpretation of God's will. Further south, Lord Baltimore establishes Maryland as a haven for English Catholics, while the Carolinas are granted to proprietors who envision a feudal society with themselves as lords and their settlers as tenants. New York begins as New Amsterdam, a Dutch trading post focused on the fur trade, before being seized by the English in 1664. Pennsylvania is founded by William Penn as a Quaker colony committed to peaceful coexistence with Native Americans and religious tolerance for all Christians. Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies, is established in 1733 as a buffer against Spanish Florida and a place where England's worthy poor can start fresh. By the early 18th century, these colonies have developed distinct regional identities. New England, with its rocky soil and harsh winters, develops an economy based on fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The middle colonies, blessed with fertile soil and navigable rivers, become the breadbasket of the colonial world, producing wheat and other grains for export. The southern colonies, with their warm climate and long growing season, develop plantation economies based on tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, rice and indigo in the Carolinas, each crop requiring vast amounts of labor and driving the expansion of slavery. The population of the colonies grows through both immigration and natural increase. By 1770, more than 2 million people live in the 13 colonies, though this figure does not include the hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples whose numbers have been decimated by disease, war, and displacement. The colonial population is remarkably diverse: English, Scots-Irish, German, Dutch, French Huguenot, African, with smaller numbers of Swedes, Jews, and others. This diversity, which will eventually become a source of American strength, is initially a source of tension and division. The colonies exist within the framework of British mercantilism, an economic system designed to benefit the mother country. The Navigation Acts require that colonial trade be conducted in British ships, that certain valuable products like tobacco and indigo can only be sold to Britain, that manufactured goods must be purchased from British suppliers rather than produced in the colonies. This system creates resentment among colonial merchants and manufacturers, but for most of the colonial period, it is accepted as the price of British military protection and access to British markets. The relationship between the colonies and Britain begins to shift after the French and Indian War, the American theater of the global 7 Years' War. This conflict, lasting from 1754 to 1763, pits British colonists and their Native American allies against French colonists and their indigenous partners in a struggle for control of the Ohio River Valley and ultimately all of North America. The war begins badly for the British, with a young Virginia colonel named George Washington suffering defeat in his first military command, with British General Braddock's army ambushed and destroyed near Fort Duquesne. But British resources and naval power eventually prevail. William Pitt, directing the British war effort, pours money and troops into North America, while the Royal Navy cuts French supply lines across the Atlantic. Quebec falls to General Wolfe in 1759 in a daring assault that costs both Wolfe and his French counterpart Montcalm their lives. Montreal surrenders the following year, and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 gives Britain control of all French territory in North America east of the Mississippi, along with Florida from Spain. This tremendous victory paradoxically sets in motion the events that will lead to American independence. The war has cost Britain an enormous sum of money, doubling its national debt, and British officials believe the colonists should help pay for their own defense. The war has also removed the French threat that made colonists dependent on British military protection, eliminating one of the main reasons colonists had for accepting British authority. And the British decision to prevent colonial expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains, the Proclamation of 1763, designed to reduce conflict with Native Americans and administrative costs, infuriates colonists who see the vast western lands as their reward for victory. The British government, under King George III and his ministers, begins imposing a series of taxes and regulations designed to raise revenue in the colonies and assert parliamentary authority. The Sugar Act of 1764 reduces the duty on molasses but strengthens enforcement, hurting colonial merchants who had grown accustomed to smuggling. The Stamp Act of 1765 requires that all legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards bear a tax stamp, directly affecting every colonist rather than just merchants. The colonial reaction to the Stamp Act surprises and alarms British officials. In towns throughout the colonies, people organize resistance, forming groups called Sons of Liberty who intimidate stamp tax collectors into resigning their posts. In Massachusetts, a mob burns the lieutenant governor's house. In New York, angry crowds destroy the home of a British officer. Representatives from 9 colonies meet in New York for a Stamp Act Congress, where they assert that Parliament has no right to tax the colonies since they have no representation in that body. No taxation without representation becomes a rallying cry that captures the fundamental constitutional issue at stake. The British Parliament, surprised by the intensity of colonial opposition and concerned about the impact of colonial boycotts on British merchants, repeals the Stamp Act in 1766. But at the same time, it passes the Declaratory Act, asserting that Parliament has the right to make laws for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. This combination of tactical retreat and theoretical assertion of authority satisfies no one and resolves nothing. The fundamental question remains, do the colonies exist for the benefit of Britain, or are they societies with their own interests and rights? The Townshend Acts of 1767 try a different approach, imposing duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. The revenue is to be used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, making them independent of colonial legislatures that had previously controlled their compensation. The colonists respond with another boycott of British goods, with women organizing spinning bees to produce homespun cloth rather than by British textiles, making the political act of resistance part of daily domestic life. Tensions escalate steadily through the late 1760s. British troops are stationed in Boston to enforce customs laws and maintain order, but their presence inflames rather than calms the situation. On March 5, 1770, a confrontation between soldiers and civilians turns deadly when British troops fire into a crowd, killing 5 colonists in what becomes known as the Boston Massacre. The soldiers are tried for murder, and in a testament to colonial respect for law, they are defended by John Adams, a leading patriot, who wins acquittal for most of them by arguing they acted in self-defense against a threatening mob. A period of relative calm follows as most of the Townshend duties are repealed, with only the tax on tea remaining as a symbol of Parliament's right to tax the colonies. But in 1773, the issue explodes again when Parliament passes the Tea Act, giving the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies and allowing it to sell directly to retailers rather than through colonial merchants. Though the act actually reduces the price of tea, colonists see it as a trick to get them to accept parliamentary taxation by making it palatable. On the night of December 16, 1773, men disguised as Mohawk Indians board 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dump 45 tons of tea into the water in what becomes known as the Boston Tea Party. The destruction of property worth £10,000 is both a political protest and a criminal act, and the British government decides the time has come to assert its authority firmly. Parliament passes a series of measures the colonists call the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor until the tea is paid for, restructuring Massachusetts government to reduce local autonomy, allowing royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies, and requiring colonists to house British troops in their homes if necessary. These punitive measures, designed to isolate and intimidate Massachusetts, instead unite the colonies in sympathy and alarm. If Parliament can destroy Massachusetts' charter and traditional liberties, what is to prevent it from doing the same to the other colonies? In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies meet in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, where they organize a comprehensive boycott of British goods and agree to reconvene the following spring if their grievances are not addressed. The situation drifts toward war through the winter of 1774 to 1775. In Massachusetts, patriots begin stockpiling weapons and organizing militia units they call Minutemen, ready to respond at a moment's notice. British General Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, receives orders to arrest rebel leaders and seize these military supplies. On April 18, 1775, British troops march out of Boston toward Concord, where intelligence reports that weapons are stored. But the Patriots have organized an intelligence network, and Paul Revere and William Dawes ride through the night warning that the regulars are out. When British troops reach Lexington Green at dawn on April 19, they find 70 Minutemen drawn up in formation. Someone fires a shot, whether British soldier or American militia is forever disputed. And in the confusion that follows, the British troops fire a volley that kills 8 colonists and wounds 10 more. The British march onto Concord, where they destroy some military supplies, but by now, militia from throughout the region are converging on the area. As the British begin their return march to Boston, they find themselves under constant attack from Americans firing from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The retreat becomes a running battle that leaves 73 British soldiers dead and nearly 200 wounded or missing. Only the arrival of reinforcements saves the British column from complete destruction. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord are remembered as the shot heard round the world, the beginning of open warfare between Britain and her American colonies. But even now, many colonists hope for reconciliation. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia in May 1775, takes charge of the war effort and appoints George Washington commander of the Continental Army, but it also sends the Olive Branch petition to King George III, professing loyalty and begging him to intervene to resolve the crisis. The king refuses even to receive the petition, and Parliament declares the colonies in rebellion. In January 1776, Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense, a pamphlet that makes the case for complete independence in language any common person can understand. Paine argues that it is absurd for a continent to be ruled by an island, that monarchy itself is an unjust form of government, that America has nothing to gain and everything to lose by remaining tied to Britain. Common Sense sells over 100,000 copies in its first 3 months, reaching an enormous audience in a population where 1 in 5 people is literate. The momentum toward independence becomes unstoppable. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress votes for independence, and on July 4, it approves the Declaration of Independence, primarily written by Thomas Jefferson. This document does more than simply announce separation from Britain. It articulates a political philosophy that will resonate throughout subsequent American history and inspire democratic movements around the world. We hold these truths to be self-evident, Jefferson writes, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words are revolutionary in their implications, even if their application is tragically limited. When Jefferson writes that all men are created equal, he does not include the hundreds of enslaved people he personally owns, nor does he include women or Native Americans. Yet the principles he articulates contain the seeds of a more expansive understanding of human equality, principles that future generations will use to challenge slavery, to demand women's suffrage, to advance civil rights. The Declaration establishes an ideal that America will spend the next 2.5 centuries slowly, painfully, trying to live up to. But in 1776, the immediate question is not whether these principles are perfectly applied but whether American independence can survive at all. Britain is the most powerful nation on earth, with the world's strongest navy, a professional army, and vast resources. The American colonies are divided. Perhaps 1/3 of colonists actively support independence, 1/3 remain loyal to Britain, and 1/3 try to remain neutral, with no real army, no navy, little money, and no experience as an independent nation. The war that follows lasts 8 years and tests American resolve to the breaking point. The British strategy is to use their naval superiority to capture key ports and their professional soldiers to crush the Continental Army in conventional battles. They nearly succeed in 1776, when Washington's army is repeatedly defeated and driven out of New York, retreating across New Jersey with the British in pursuit. By December, the American cause seems lost, enlistments are expiring, and Washington commands fewer than 3,000 dispirited men. Washington's response is one of the most daring gambles in military history. On Christmas night, 1776, he leads his army across the ice-choked Delaware River and surprises the Hessian garrison at Trenton in a dawn attack. The Americans capture nearly 1,000 German mercenaries and seize desperately needed supplies, all at the cost of only 4 wounded Americans. A week later, Washington outmaneuvers a British force at Princeton, winning another small but crucial victory. These triumphs, achieved when defeat seemed certain, restore American morale and prove that professional soldiers are not invincible when facing determined citizen soldiers fighting for their own freedom. The war settles into a pattern where British forces can win conventional battles but cannot translate military victories into political control. They occupy New York, Philadelphia, and other cities, but the countryside remains in Patriot hands. British General Burgoyne attempts to split the colonies by marching south from Canada through the Hudson Valley, but he is surrounded at Saratoga in October 1777 and forced to surrender his entire army. This American victory, achieved by a combination of regular troops under Horatio Gates and militia sharpshooters under Daniel Morgan, proves to be the war's turning point. The victory at Saratoga convinces France that American independence is achievable, and in 1778, the French formally ally with the United States, providing money, weapons, troops, and most importantly, naval power to challenge British control of the seas. Spain and the Netherlands also enter the war against Britain, transforming an American rebellion into a global conflict. Britain now faces enemies not just in North America but in the Caribbean, Mediterranean, India, and home waters, stretching its military resources to the breaking point. The war drags on through years of brutal fighting, suffering, and sacrifice. Washington keeps his army together through terrible hardships. The winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778, when soldiers lack proper clothing, food, and shelter, when disease kills more men than British bullets, when 2,000 men die and another 1,000 desert, yet the core of the army remains intact, drilled into an effective fighting force by Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who volunteers his services to the American cause. In the South, the war becomes particularly vicious, with patriots and loyalists engaging in a bitter civil war, burning each other's farms, hanging prisoners, showing little mercy. British forces under Lord Cornwallis marched through the Carolinas winning battles but suffering constant harassment from guerrilla leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, who strikes from the forests and swamps and melts away before British forces can retaliate. Slowly, the British position in the South becomes untenable, their supply lines stretched thin, their troops exhausted, their loyalist allies losing hope. In 1781, Cornwallis makes a fatal decision, marching his army to Yorktown on the Virginia coast, expecting the Royal Navy to resupply him or evacuate him if necessary. But Washington and the French commander Rochambeau see an opportunity. Moving with remarkable speed and secrecy, they march their combined Franco-American army south from New York while the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse drives off the British Navy and establishes control of Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis finds himself trapped, besieged by an army of 17,000 Americans and French while the French fleet prevents escape by sea. The siege lasts 3 weeks, with constant bombardment reducing British defenses and morale. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders, and as his troops march out to lay down their weapons, their band plays "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting tune for the spectacle of British professional soldiers surrendering to colonial rebels they had dismissed as rabble. The surrender at Yorktown effectively ends the war, though fighting continues sporadically and peace negotiations drag on for another 2 years. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, formally recognizes American independence and grants the new nation all British territory east of the Mississippi River, north to Canada, and south to Florida. It is a generous peace, far more generous than American military victories alone might justify, reflecting Britain's desire to detach America from its alliance with France and re-establish profitable trade relations. But winning independence is only the first step. The harder task is creating a government for the new nation, and here the revolutionaries face challenges that will test their political wisdom as severely as the war tested their military courage. During the war, the colonies have operated under the Articles of Confederation, which creates little more than a league of friendship among independent states. The national government has no power to tax, no executive to enforce laws, no federal judiciary, no control over interstate or foreign commerce. It can request money from the states but cannot compel payment, making it nearly impossible to pay off war debts or maintain even a minimal military establishment. The weaknesses of the Articles become painfully apparent in the mid-1780s. The states erect trade barriers against each other, treating their neighbors almost like foreign nations. The government cannot pay its debts, and American credit collapses. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786, when debt-ridden farmers led by Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays take up arms to prevent courts from foreclosing on their property, exposes the government's inability to maintain order and protect property rights. These problems convince many American leaders that a stronger national government is necessary if the republic is to survive. In May 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refuses to participate, gather in Philadelphia for a convention ostensibly called to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, meeting in secret through a hot summer with all windows shuttered to preserve confidentiality, they draft an entirely new constitution that creates a fundamentally different kind of government. The constitution they produce is a masterpiece of political architecture, balancing power between large and small states, between the national government and the states, among three branches of government designed to check and balance each other. The legislative branch, divided into a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate where each state has equal representation, holds the power to make laws and control taxation. The executive branch, headed by a president elected indirectly through an electoral college, has the power to enforce laws and conduct foreign policy. The judicial branch, led by a Supreme Court, has the power to interpret laws and the Constitution itself. The system includes numerous compromises, some principled and some morally troubling. The Great Compromise satisfies both large and small states by creating a bicameral legislature. The Three-Fifths Compromise, counting enslaved people as three-fifths of a person for purposes of representation and taxation, gives Southern states greater influence while acknowledging without endorsing slavery's existence. The Constitution allows the slave trade to continue for 20 more years, a concession to South Carolina and Georgia that represents a devil's bargain, sacrificing moral principle for political unity. The fight over ratification divides Americans between Federalists who support the Constitution and Anti-Federalists who fear it creates a government too powerful and distant from the people. The debate produces some of the finest political writing in American history, particularly the Federalist Papers, 85 essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay under the pseudonym Publius, defending the Constitution and explaining its principles. The Anti-Federalists raise serious concerns about the absence of a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties, about the power of the federal government to override state authority, about whether a republic can survive across such a large territory. The Constitution supporters promise that a Bill of Rights will be added as amendments, and this promise proves decisive. Delaware ratifies first, then Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The debate is closest in the largest states. Massachusetts ratifies narrowly after Sam Adams throws his support behind the Constitution. Virginia ratifies after a fierce debate pitting James Madison against Patrick Henry. New York ratifies after Alexander Hamilton's tireless advocacy. By the summer of 1788, 11 states have ratified, more than the 9 required, and the new government can begin operation. In April 1789, George Washington is inaugurated as the first president, establishing precedents that will shape the office for centuries to come. He creates a cabinet of department heads to advise him, including Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. He establishes the principle of civilian control over the military by resigning his commission and accepting the presidency as a civilian. Most importantly, he establishes the precedent of voluntary retirement, stepping down after 2 terms when he could almost certainly have been re-elected for life, demonstrating that America would be a republic of laws, not a dictatorship of even the most benign leader. The first decade under the Constitution sees the new government put into practice the principles outlined in that document while also revealing tensions about what kind of nation America should become. Alexander Hamilton, brilliant and ambitious, presents Congress with a series of reports outlining his vision for America's economic future. He proposes that the federal government assume all state debts from the Revolutionary War, establishing the credit of the national government. He proposes creating a national bank to manage government finances and provide a stable currency. He proposes tariffs to protect infant American industries from foreign competition and to raise revenue. He proposes creating a small permanent navy and maintaining a professional army. Hamilton's vision is of a commercial, industrial, urban America integrated into the Atlantic economy, with a strong national government actively promoting economic development. Thomas Jefferson, his rival and philosophical opposite, envisions a very different America, agricultural, rural, decentralized, with power reserved to the states and individual farmers forming the backbone of Republican virtue. The conflict between these visions shapes the early republic as Hamilton and Jefferson gather followers, creating the first American political parties, Federalists following Hamilton, Democratic Republicans following Jefferson. The disagreement goes beyond economics to fundamental questions about human nature and government's role. Hamilton, influenced by his wartime experience watching the Continental Congress fail to support the army, believes people are motivated by self-interest and that government must be strong enough to control their passions and channel their energies productively. Jefferson, influenced by the Enlightenment and his faith in human reason, believes that people are capable of self-government if left free from excessive governmental interference, that the best government is that which governs least. Foreign policy adds another dimension to these divisions. When revolutionary France goes to war against a coalition of monarchies in 1793, Americans debate whether to support their French allies who had helped them win independence or to maintain neutrality to protect American commerce. Hamilton favors Britain, America's primary trading partner, seeing British naval power as essential to American security. Jefferson favors France, seeing the French Revolution as an extension of America's own revolutionary principles. Washington carefully steers a neutral course, issuing a neutrality proclamation that angers both sides but keeps America out of European wars. The tensions reach a crisis point in 1798 when the XYZ affair, French officials demanding bribes as a precondition for negotiations, brings America and France to the brink of war. The Federalist Congress, now led by President John Adams after Washington's retirement, passes the Alien and Sedition Acts, making it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious statements against the government. These acts represent a betrayal of the free speech principles enshrined in the First Amendment, and their enforcement against Republican newspaper editors convinces many Americans that the Federalists seek to establish a tyrannical government. The election of 1800 becomes a referendum on these issues, and Jefferson defeats Adams in a bitter campaign marked by personal attacks and fears that the Union might split if the losing side refuses to accept the result. When Jefferson takes office in March 1801, the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, something that seems routine today but was unprecedented in its time, proves that the constitutional system can survive deep political divisions. Jefferson calls his victory the Revolution of 1800, and in his inaugural address, he tries to heal the partisan wounds by declaring, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." Jefferson's presidency marks a shift toward a more limited federal government at home, but paradoxically, his greatest achievement requires a dramatic expansion of federal power. When Spain secretly transfers Louisiana to France in 1800, Jefferson fears that French control of New Orleans will threaten American access to the Mississippi River, essential for Western farmers to ship their produce to market. He authorizes his minister to France, Robert Livingston, to negotiate for the purchase of New Orleans. But Napoleon, facing renewed war with Britain and needing money more than colonial territory, offers to sell all of Louisiana, 828,000 square miles stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. For $15 million, less than 3 cents an acre, America can double its size. Jefferson, despite constitutional scruples about whether the federal government has the power to acquire new territory, cannot resist this opportunity. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 transforms America's geographical and psychological landscape, making continental expansion seem not just possible but inevitable. Jefferson immediately organizes an expedition to explore this new territory, led by his private secretary Meriwether Lewis and Lewis's friend William Clark. The Lewis and Clark expedition, lasting from 1804 to 1806, travels up the Missouri River, crosses the Rocky Mountains with the help of a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, and reaches the Pacific Ocean, mapping a route that will guide future migrants and documenting the natural resources, indigenous peoples, and geographic features of the West. The expedition's success fuels American imagination about the continent's possibilities, but it also begins a tragic process of displacement for the Native American peoples who have lived in these lands for millennia. The Constitution's promise of equality extends only to white men, and even then imperfectly. Enslaved people remain property without rights. Women remain subject to their fathers and husbands, without the vote or independent legal identity. Native Americans are viewed as obstacles to progress, to be pushed aside or eliminated as white settlement expands westward. The contradiction between American ideals and American practice becomes increasingly stark in the early 19th century. The Declaration's promise that all men are created equal coexists with an economic system in the South that depends entirely on enslaved labor. The Constitution's protection of property rights includes the right to own human beings. The expansion of democracy for white men. By the 1820s, most states have eliminated property requirements for voting, happened simultaneously with the expansion of slavery into new territories. The War of 1812, often called America's Second War of Independence, reveals both American weakness and growing strength. The causes are complex: British impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, British support for Native American resistance to American expansion in the Northwest, American desire to conquer Canada, Southern and Western war hawks seeking territorial expansion. President James Madison, Jefferson's successor, asks Congress to declare war in June 1812, and a divided Congress narrowly agrees. The war goes badly for America at first. An attempted invasion of Canada ends in disaster, with General William Hull surrendering Detroit without firing a shot. British forces burn Washington, D.C. in August 1814, sending President Madison and Congress fleeing into the countryside. Only the successful defense of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor, inspiring Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner, and the victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain prevent a complete military collapse. But American forces have better success at sea, where frigates like the USS Constitution win surprising victories against Royal Navy vessels, and privateers capture hundreds of British merchant ships. And in the South, Andrew Jackson leads a motley force of regulars, militia, and pirates to a decisive victory over British veterans at New Orleans in January 1815, killing more than 2,000 British soldiers while losing only 13 Americans in a lopsided triumph that makes Jackson a national hero. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve 1814 before the Battle of New Orleans is even fought, resolves none of the issues that caused the war, essentially restoring the status quo that existed before hostilities began. Yet Americans interpret the war as a victory, proof that their republic can defend itself against the world's greatest power. The war's end brings what historians call the era of good feelings, a period when partisan divisions temporarily fade, when nationalism surges, when Americans look westward with confidence and optimism. The years following the war see explosive westward expansion and economic growth. New states enter the Union with remarkable speed: Indiana in 1816, Mississippi in 1817, Illinois in 1818, Alabama in 1819, Missouri in 1821. The population spreads beyond the Appalachian Mountains, with tens of thousands of families loading their possessions into covered wagons and heading west seeking land and opportunity. The National Road, stretching from Cumberland, Maryland, westward across the Alleghenies, becomes a highway of migration, crowded with wagons, livestock, and people walking toward their imagined futures. This expansion comes at terrible cost to Native Americans who occupy these lands. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795, the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809, and countless other agreements extract land cessions from tribes already weakened by disease, warfare, and the disruption of traditional economies. When some native peoples resist, like the Shawnee leader Tecumseh who attempts to unite tribes against American expansion, they are crushed by superior American numbers and firepower. Tecumseh dies fighting alongside British forces in the War of 1812, his confederation dissolving with his death. The economic transformation of these decades is equally dramatic. In 1813, Francis Cabot Lowell visits British textile mills, memorizes the design of power looms that Britain forbids exporting, and returns to Massachusetts to build America's first integrated textile factory at Waltham, where all stages of cloth production occur under one roof. His success sparks an industrial revolution that transforms New England from a region of small farms and merchant shipping into an industrial powerhouse of textile mills, shoe factories, and machine shops. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825 after 8 years of construction, creates a water route from New York City up the Hudson River to Albany, then west across New York State to Lake Erie, opening the Great Lakes region to commerce with the Atlantic coast. This engineering marvel, 363 miles long, cuts transportation costs so dramatically that wheat from Ohio farms can now compete in New York markets with wheat from nearby farms. The canal transforms New York City into America's commercial capital while making towns along its route, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Albany, into thriving cities. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 has even more profound and tragic consequences. This simple machine, which separates cotton fibers from seeds 50 times faster than human hands can do, makes cotton cultivation profitable in the upland South where short staple cotton grows but is difficult to process. Almost overnight, cotton becomes the South's dominant crop, expanding across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and eventually into Texas. But cotton cultivation requires intensive labor, and the cotton gin's efficiency doesn't reduce the need for workers, it increases it by making cotton farming profitable over vast territories. The result is a massive expansion of slavery just when many people, North and South, had expected the institution to gradually die out. The slave population, about 700,000 at the nation's founding, grows to nearly 4 million by 1860. The internal slave trade tears apart families as traders buy enslaved people in the Upper South, where tobacco cultivation is declining, and sell them to cotton planters in the Deep South. The horrific Middle Passage may have ended with the constitutional ban on importing slaves in 1808, but domestic slave markets in Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans become centers of a brutal trade that treats human beings as commodities. Slavery transforms from a necessary evil that many founders hoped would fade away into a positive good that its defenders proclaim as beneficial for both enslaved and enslaver. Southern politicians, intellectuals, and ministers develop elaborate justifications for slavery, arguing that it is sanctioned by the Bible, that African peoples are naturally inferior and benefit from the civilizing influence of slavery, that slavery is more humane than the wage labor system of the North that leaves workers to starve when they are no longer useful. These arguments become increasingly strident and defensive as Northern opposition to slavery grows. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 reveals the growing sectional tension over slavery's expansion. When Missouri applies for statehood as a slave state in 1819, Northern congressmen propose restricting slavery's spread, while Southern representatives insist that Congress has no power to impose such restrictions. The debate becomes bitter and threatening, with aged Thomas Jefferson writing that the controversy, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. The compromise admits Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state to preserve the sectional balance in the Senate, and prohibits slavery in the Louisiana Purchase territory north of Missouri's southern border, the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel. This compromise postpones rather than resolves the fundamental conflict, buying 40 years of peace but ensuring that every subsequent territorial acquisition will reignite the slavery debate. The question is no longer whether slavery will eventually end but whether it will expand or be contained, and both sides understand that control of new territories will determine the institution's long-term survival. The 1820s and 1830s see the emergence of Jacksonian democracy, named for Andrew Jackson, who wins the presidency in 1828 after losing a contested election in 1824. Jackson, the first president from west of the Appalachians, the first not born into wealth or privilege, represents a new kind of American politics, more democratic in some ways, more brutal in others. His presidency expands voting rights for white men while implementing policies of ethnic cleansing against Native Americans. Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States represents his democratic populism at its purest. The bank, chartered by Congress and partially owned by the federal government, serves as a central bank, managing government deposits, issuing paper currency, and regulating credit. Nicholas Biddle, the bank's brilliant but arrogant president, makes the bank a powerful force for economic stability, but Jackson sees it as a monster of privilege that benefits wealthy Eastern elites at the expense of common people. When Congress passes a bill to recharter the bank in 1832, Jackson vetoes it with a ringing message that attacks the bank as unconstitutional and undemocratic. Jackson's victory over the bank in the subsequent election validates his political instincts, but his destruction of the bank's regulatory role contributes to economic instability. Without the bank's restraining influence, state-chartered banks issue paper money recklessly, speculation in Western lands runs wild, and the economy overheats. When Jackson issues the Specie Circular in 1836, requiring that Western lands be purchased with gold or silver rather than paper money, the speculative bubble bursts, triggering the Panic of 1837 and a depression that lasts 6 years. Jackson's Indian removal policy represents the darkest aspect of his presidency. Despite Supreme Court rulings affirming Cherokee treaty rights and sovereignty, Jackson supports Georgia's efforts to expel the Cherokee from their ancestral lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 passes Congress by narrow margins, authorizing the president to negotiate treaties exchanging Native American lands in the East for territory west of the Mississippi. In practice, these negotiations involve coercion and fraud, with the government recognizing illegitimate tribal representatives and presenting removal as inevitable. The Cherokee removal, culminating in the Trail of Tears of 1838 to 1839, exemplifies the policy's brutality. Federal troops force 16,000 Cherokee from their homes, herding them into camps and then marching them west under terrible conditions. More than 4,000 die from exposure, disease, and starvation during the forced march. The Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples suffer similar fates, though the Seminole wage a 7-year guerrilla war in the Florida swamps before most are defeated and removed. These removals open millions of acres in the southeast to white settlement and cotton cultivation, accelerating the region's economic development while destroying societies that had existed for centuries. The bitter irony is that the Cherokee had done everything white Americans claimed to want. They had adopted farming, Christianity, written language, and constitutional government, yet none of it saved them when white Georgians wanted their gold and their land. The 1840s bring new territorial expansion that makes the slavery question unavoidable. The Republic of Texas, independent since 1836 after winning its revolution against Mexico, seeks annexation by the United States. Northern politicians oppose this, seeing it as a plot to expand slavery and add slave states that will give the South greater political power. Southern politicians enthusiastically support annexation. The issue becomes entangled in the presidential election of 1844, where James K. Polk wins on an expansionist platform promising to acquire not just Texas but also Oregon country, jointly occupied with Britain, and California, controlled by Mexico. Polk fulfills his promises with remarkable efficiency, though the methods vary. The Oregon question is resolved peacefully through negotiation with Britain, extending the 49th parallel boundary to the Pacific and giving America the territory that becomes Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. The acquisition of California and the Southwest requires war with Mexico, a conflict that many Americans, including a young Illinois congressman named Abraham Lincoln, regard as aggressive and unjust. The Mexican-American War begins in April 1846 after Mexican forces attack American troops in disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Polk claims Mexico has shed American blood upon American soil, though the territory's status is ambiguous at best. Congress declares war, and American forces invade Mexico from multiple directions. General Zachary Taylor advances into northern Mexico, winning victories at Monterrey and Buena Vista. Colonel Stephen Kearny leads an expedition that conquers New Mexico and California. General Winfield Scott lands at Veracruz and marches inland to Mexico City, following the same route Cortés took 3 centuries earlier. The war ends in February 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gives the United States California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, more than 500,000 square miles of territory, in exchange for $15 million and the assumption of American citizens' claims against Mexico. This acquisition realizes Polk's expansionist vision, extending American territory to the Pacific and seemingly fulfilling the concept of manifest destiny, the belief that America is destined to spread across the continent. But this triumph immediately resurrects the slavery question in its most divisive form. Even before the war ends, Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania proposes that slavery be prohibited in any territory acquired from Mexico. The Wilmot proviso passes the House repeatedly but is always blocked in the Senate, where the slave states' equal representation gives them veto power. The question of whether slavery will be allowed in California, New Mexico, Utah, and other newly acquired territories dominates American politics for the next decade and eventually tears the nation apart. The California Gold Rush, beginning in January 1848 when James Marshall discovers gold at Sutter's Mill, complicates the territorial question by bringing a flood of settlers whose demand for rapid statehood cannot be ignored. By 1849, more than 80,000 people have rushed to California, coming by wagon across the plains and mountains, by ship around South America, or by ship to Panama, crossing the disease-ridden isthmus, and boarding another ship to San Francisco. This chaotic, lawless, exhilarating migration transforms California from a sleepy Mexican province into a booming American territory demanding immediate admission to the Union. The Compromise of 1850, crafted by aging Senator Henry Clay and guided through Congress by Stephen Douglas after Clay's health fails, represents one last attempt to satisfy both sections. California enters as a free state, upsetting the balance in the Senate. The territories of New Mexico and Utah are organized without restrictions on slavery, leaving the question to be decided by the territories themselves, what Douglas calls popular sovereignty. The slave trade is abolished in Washington, D.C., though slavery itself remains legal there. And most controversially, a new fugitive slave law requires northern citizens to assist in capturing and returning escaped slaves, turning every free state into a hunting ground for slave catchers. The fugitive slave law outrages Northerners who now must actively participate in slavery rather than simply tolerate its existence elsewhere. When slave catchers appear in northern communities to seize black people, sometimes free persons kidnapped on false claims, sometimes genuine fugitives who have lived peacefully in the North for years, mobs sometimes form to resist. The law radicalizes moderates who previously accepted compromise, making slavery a moral issue that cannot be evaded. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, dramatizes slavery's cruelties and sells 300,000 copies in its first year, shaping Northern opinion more effectively than any political speech. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 shatters the sectional peace by reopening the question of slavery in territories where it had been settled. Senator Stephen Douglas proposes organizing Kansas and Nebraska territories, using popular sovereignty to determine slavery's status despite these territories lying north of the Missouri Compromise line where slavery was supposedly forever prohibited. Douglas, seeking Southern support for a transcontinental railroad with a northern route, is willing to repeal the Missouri Compromise to get it. The act passes, but the consequences are disastrous. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rush into Kansas, each side determined to control the territorial legislature. Violence erupts as both sides stuff ballot boxes, intimidate opponents, and eventually resort to guerrilla warfare. Bleeding Kansas becomes a preview of the larger Civil War to come, with pro-slavery forces from Missouri battling Free Soil settlers from New England, with murders, massacres, and arson becoming routine. In May 1856, pro-slavery forces sacked the Free Soil town of Lawrence. In response, abolitionist John Brown and his sons murder 5 pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek, hacking them to death with swords in cold blood. The violence spreads even to Congress, where South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks beats Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner nearly to death with a cane on the Senate floor, retaliating for Sumner's speech mocking Brooks's cousin. Sumner takes 3 years to recover from his injuries, during which time Massachusetts re-elects him, leaving his empty chair as a symbol of Southern violence. Brooks becomes a hero in the South, receiving dozens of replacement canes from admirers. The Dred Scott decision of 1857, delivered by a Supreme Court majority dominated by Southern justices, attempts to resolve the slavery question through judicial fiat but instead makes compromise impossible. Dred Scott, an enslaved man whose master had taken him to live in free territory before returning to Missouri, sues for his freedom, arguing that residence in free territory made him free. Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing for the majority, rules that black people, whether enslaved or free, cannot be citizens and therefore have no standing to sue in federal court. He goes further, declaring that Congress has no constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, making the Missouri Compromise and all similar restrictions unconstitutional. The decision outrages Northerners, who see it as proof that a slave power conspiracy controls all 3 branches of government and is attempting to nationalize slavery. Frederick Douglass, the era's most prominent black abolitionist, declares that the decision cannot be the final word on slavery because it violates the fundamental principles of the Declaration of Independence. Abraham Lincoln, an Illinois lawyer and former congressman emerging as a Republican leader, argues that the founders intended to place slavery on a course toward ultimate extinction, and the court's decision reverses that intent. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, during the Illinois Senate campaign, articulate the fundamental disagreement over slavery's future. Douglas, defending popular sovereignty, argues that each territory and state should decide the slavery question for itself without federal interference, claiming to be neutral on slavery's morality. Lincoln responds that slavery is morally wrong and that the federal government must prevent its expansion into new territories, though he acknowledges that the Constitution protects slavery where it already exists. Douglas wins the Senate seat, but Lincoln's eloquent arguments make him a national figure and position him for a presidential run. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 represents the ultimate rejection of political compromise. Brown, convinced that slavery will only end through violence, leads 21 men in seizing the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, planning to arm enslaved people and spark a general uprising. The plan fails almost immediately, no uprising occurs, and Brown and his men are trapped in the arsenal by local militia and then by federal troops under Colonel Robert E. Lee. Brown is captured, tried for treason, and hanged in December 1859. The raid terrifies the South, convincing many that Northerners want to incite slave rebellion and racial warfare. Brown becomes a martyr in the North, with church bells tolling on the day of his execution, with Ralph Waldo Emerson calling him a new saint awaiting his martyrdom who will make the gallows glorious like the cross. The raid and its aftermath convince both sections that the other is implacably hostile and that peaceful coexistence may no longer be possible. The presidential election of 1860 takes place in this atmosphere of crisis and mutual suspicion. The Democratic Party splits along sectional lines, with Northern Democrats nominating Stephen Douglas and Southern Democrats nominating John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. A remnant of former Whigs and moderate Democrats form the Constitutional Union Party and nominate John Bell of Tennessee, pledging to preserve the Union without addressing slavery. The Republican Party nominates Abraham Lincoln, who has emerged from the debates with Douglas as the most articulate spokesman for restricting slavery's expansion. Lincoln wins with only 40% of the popular vote but a solid majority in the Electoral College, carrying every free state except New Jersey. He does not appear on the ballot in most slave states and receives virtually no votes there. For the first time, a president is elected entirely by one section, without significant support from the other, proving that the two sections have become separate political communities with incompatible values and interests. South Carolina responds to Lincoln's election by seceding from the Union in December 1860, declaring that the free states have violated the Constitutional Compact and that South Carolina is resuming its sovereignty as an independent nation. 6 more Deep South states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, follow by February 1861, before Lincoln is even inaugurated. Representatives from these states meet in Montgomery, Alabama, to form the Confederate States of America, adopt a constitution modeled on the U.S. Constitution but explicitly protecting slavery, and elect Jefferson Davis as president. Lincoln, in his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, tries to reassure the South that he has no intention of interfering with slavery where it exists, but he also declares that no state can legally secede and that he will preserve the Union. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war, he declares. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. The crisis comes to a head at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, a federal installation that South Carolina demands be surrendered to Confederate authority. Lincoln faces an impossible choice. If he reinforces the fort, he appears to be the aggressor, but if he abandons it, he tacitly acknowledges Confederate independence. He chooses a middle course, sending supply ships to provision the fort but not reinforcements. Confederate President Davis, under pressure from fire eaters demanding action, orders the fort's reduction before the supplies arrive. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opens fire on Fort Sumter, bombarding it for 34 hours until Major Robert Anderson surrenders. No one is killed in the bombardment, but the attack galvanizes Northern opinion, transforming the secession crisis into a war for the Union. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, and 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, secede rather than participate in coercing their southern neighbors back into the Union. The American Civil War that follows is the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history, killing more Americans than all the country's other wars combined until Vietnam. It begins with both sides expecting a quick victory, Northerners believing that superior numbers and industrial capacity will crush the rebellion within months, Southerners believing that their military tradition, fighting spirit, and defensive advantages will exhaust Northern will to continue the war. Both are tragically wrong. The First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 shatters Northern illusions of easy victory. A Federal army under General Irvin McDowell marches toward Richmond, the new Confederate capital, expecting to crush the rebellion with one decisive blow. But Confederate forces under Generals Beauregard and Johnston, reinforced by troops under Thomas Jackson, who earns the nickname Stonewall for his steadfast defense, throw back the federal assault and send the Union Army fleeing back to Washington in a route that demonstrates this will be a long, hard war. President Lincoln appoints George B. McClellan to rebuild the Army of the Potomac, and over the winter of 1861 to 1862, McClellan trains and organizes an impressive force of over 100,000 men. But McClellan, though an excellent organizer, proves too cautious as a field commander. His Peninsula Campaign in the spring of 1862, approaching Richmond from the southeast, moves so slowly that Confederate General Robert E. Lee, newly appointed to command after General Johnston is wounded, is able to concentrate forces and drive McClellan back in a series of battles known as the 7 Days. The war's nature changes as it becomes clear that neither side will yield quickly. Lincoln faces growing pressure from abolitionists to make the war about ending slavery, not just preserving the Union. He moves cautiously, concerned about keeping the border slave states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri loyal to the Union. But after the Union victory at Antietam in September 1862, where McClellan stops Lee's first invasion of the North in the war's bloodiest single day, with over 23,000 casualties, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. This document, taking effect January 1, 1863, declares that all enslaved people in areas still in rebellion are free. It is a war measure, limited in its immediate practical effect since it does not apply to slave states loyal to the Union or to areas under federal control. But its significance transcends its legal limitations. It transforms the war from a struggle to preserve the Union into a war to end slavery, making foreign intervention on the Confederacy's behalf politically impossible for Britain and France, which have abolished slavery. It allows black men to enlist in the Union Army and Navy, ultimately bringing nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors into federal service, their courage and sacrifice helping turn the tide of war. The war grinds on through 1863 with terrible battles producing enormous casualties but no decisive results. At Fredericksburg in December 1862, Union forces under General Ambrose Burnside suffer a devastating defeat attempting to assault Lee's entrenched positions. At Chancellorsville in May 1863, Lee wins perhaps his most brilliant victory, though it costs him Stonewall Jackson, accidentally shot by his own men and dead within days. At Gettysburg in July 1863, Lee's second invasion of the North ends in disaster when 3 days of fighting leave over 50,000 casualties and force the Army of Northern Virginia to retreat back to Virginia, never again able to mount a major offensive. The Gettysburg victory comes on the same day that Ulysses S. Grant completes the siege of Vicksburg, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Grant, a failed businessman and alcoholic before the war, has proven to be the North's most effective general, willing to accept heavy casualties to achieve results, understanding that the North's advantage in manpower means it can afford attrition warfare that the South cannot. Lincoln recognizes Grant's value and in March 1864 appoints him General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant develops a coordinated strategy. He will accompany the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, engaging Lee continuously to prevent him from detaching forces to other theaters, while General William Tecumseh Sherman leads an army from Tennessee toward Atlanta, destroying Confederate resources and will to resist. The campaign of 1864 is brutally effective but horrifically costly. Grant battles Lee through the wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, suffering terrible casualties but always pressing forward rather than retreating as previous Union commanders had done. By June, Grant has maneuvered Lee into defending Petersburg and Richmond, beginning a siege that will last 9 months. Meanwhile, Sherman captures Atlanta in September, then marches across Georgia to the sea, destroying everything of military value and demonstrating that the Confederacy can no longer protect its heartland. Sherman's march to the sea and subsequent march through South Carolina represents a new kind of warfare, targeting not just enemy armies but the economic and psychological foundations that support them. His troops destroy railroads, burn mills and warehouses, confiscate livestock, and leave a 60-mile wide path of destruction. The march proves that the Confederacy is defeated, that it cannot protect its own people, hastening the war's end but also leaving scars and resentment that will last for generations. Lincoln wins re-election in November 1864 against George McClellan, his former general, running on a platform calling for peace negotiations. Sherman's capture of Atlanta and Philip Sheridan's victories in the Shenandoah Valley turn the tide of the election, convincing Northern voters that victory is achievable. Lincoln interprets his re-election as a mandate to see the war through to unconditional surrender and to end slavery permanently through constitutional amendment. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the United States, passes Congress in January 1865 after Lincoln uses all his political skill to secure the necessary two-thirds majority in the House of Representatives. The amendment represents the fulfillment of the Declaration's promise that all men are created equal, achieved not through gradual evolution but through 4 years of bloody war that has cost over 600,000 lives. Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, after his army, starved and outnumbered, can no longer continue the fight. Grant offers generous terms. Confederate soldiers can go home, keeping their horses for spring plowing, and officers can keep their sidearms. The surrender is conducted with dignity and mutual respect, with Grant preventing his men from celebrating in Lee's presence, saying, "The war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again." 5 days later, on Good Friday, April 14th, Lincoln attends a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and famous actor, enters the president's box and shoots him in the back of the head. Lincoln dies the next morning, becoming the war's final casualty. His death transforms him from a controversial politician into a martyred saint, the great emancipator who preserved the Union and freed the slaves at the cost of his own life. The challenges of Reconstruction, rebuilding the South and integrating 4 million formerly enslaved people into American society as free citizens, prove almost as difficult as winning the war. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, attempts to implement a lenient policy that quickly restores Southern states to the Union without requiring significant social change. Southern states respond by passing black codes, laws designed to keep free people in conditions as close to slavery as possible, restricting their movement, limiting their economic opportunities, and denying them the vote. Congressional Republicans, outraged by Johnson's leniency and Southern defiance, take control of Reconstruction, passing the 14th Amendment granting citizenship and equal protection under law to all persons born in the United States, and the 15th Amendment prohibiting denial of voting rights based on race. They divide the South into military districts, requiring states to ratify these amendments and grant black men voting rights as conditions for readmission to the Union. For a brief moment during radical Reconstruction, it seems that genuine racial equality might be achieved. Black men vote in large numbers, electing black representatives to state legislatures and Congress. Integrated public schools open. Freed people buy land, establish churches, reunite families separated by slavery, and exercise the rights of citizenship. The Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency, provides education, medical care, and legal assistance to formerly enslaved people making the transition to freedom. But the promise of Reconstruction is betrayed by white Southern resistance and Northern exhaustion. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan wage a campaign of terrorism against black voters and their white allies, using murder, intimidation, and fraud to restore white democratic control of Southern states. The federal government, weary of the long struggle and facing economic depression after the Panic of 1873, gradually loses will to enforce Reconstruction policies. The disputed election of 1876 is resolved by the Compromise of 1877, which gives Republican Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. The period after Reconstruction sees systematic denial of the rights that had been guaranteed to black Americans. Southern states passed Jim Crow laws mandating racial segregation in virtually all aspects of life. They use poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright violence to prevent black men from voting. The Supreme Court, in cases like Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, gives constitutional sanction to segregation, ruling that separate but equal facilities satisfy the 14th Amendment's equal protection requirement, though everyone knows that separate facilities are never equal. Yet the decades after the Civil War also see America's transformation into an industrial giant whose economic power will eventually eclipse all rivals. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific meet at Promontory Summit, Utah, physically unites the nation and opens the West to development. The railroad companies receive vast land grants from the federal government and use them to recruit settlers, transform the Great Plains from buffalo range to wheat fields, and create new cities where mining camps or empty prairie had existed. The rise of industrial capitalism in the late 19th century creates enormous wealth and equally enormous social problems. Andrew Carnegie builds a steel empire that produces more steel than all of Britain, implementing innovations like the Bessemer process that make steel affordable for everything from railroad rails to skyscrapers. John D. Rockefeller creates Standard Oil, which at its peak refines 90% of American oil, driving competitors out of business through predatory pricing, secret railroad rebates, and ruthless business tactics. J.P. Morgan becomes the most powerful banker in the world, organizing railroad systems, creating U.S. Steel as the first billion-dollar corporation, and even rescuing the federal government from bankruptcy during the Panic of 1893. These industrial titans create unprecedented wealth, but it is distributed unequally. The Gilded Age, as Mark Twain names it, glitters on the surface while hiding poverty, exploitation, and corruption underneath. Factory workers labor 60 hours per week for subsistence wages in dangerous conditions. Child labor is commonplace. Industrial accidents kill and maim workers with no compensation. Company towns keep workers in virtual peonage, paying in scrip redeemable only at company stores, charging inflated prices. Workers begin organizing to demand better conditions, leading to violent conflicts between labor and capital. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, triggered by wage cuts during economic depression, spreads across the country, paralyzing rail traffic and requiring federal troops to restore order. The Haymarket Affair of 1886 in Chicago, where a bomb kills police during a labor demonstration, leads to the execution of 4 anarchists and the persecution of labor organizers. The Homestead Strike of 1892 pits Carnegie Steel against its unionized workers in a battle that leaves 16 dead and the union destroyed. The Pullman Strike of 1894 leads President Cleveland to send federal troops to break the strike, with Eugene V. Debs, the strike's leader, imprisoned for defying an injunction. The late 19th century also sees the final conquest of the West and the completion of Native American dispossession. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, sacred land guaranteed to the Sioux by treaty, triggers a gold rush that the government makes no effort to stop. When Sioux and Cheyenne warriors resist invasion of their lands, the Army responds with a campaign to force all Native peoples onto reservations. In June 1876, warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse annihilate George Armstrong Custer's command at the Little Bighorn in the last great Native American victory, but it is also the beginning of the end. The Army relentlessly pursues the tribes until starvation and exhaustion force them onto reservations. The slaughter of the buffalo completes the destruction of Plains Indian culture. In 1870, an estimated 10 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains, providing everything Native peoples need: food, clothing, shelter, tools. By 1883, fewer than 1,000 remain, victims of hide hunters and a deliberate policy to destroy the resource base that allows Native peoples to resist. General Philip Sheridan, who commanded the campaign, remarks that buffalo hunters have done more to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 40 years. The Dawes Act of 1887 attempts to destroy tribal identity by dividing reservation land into individual plots, with surplus land sold to white settlers. The policy is justified as teaching Native Americans to farm like white Americans, but its real purpose and effect is to transfer millions of acres from tribal to white ownership. The act reduces Native American land holdings from 138 million acres in 1887 to 48 million acres by 1934. The massacre at Wounded Knee in December 1890 marks the symbolic end of Native American resistance. Ghost dance movement of the late 1880s promises that performing certain rituals will bring back the buffalo, return deceased relatives, and make the white man disappear. When Pine Ridge Sioux practiced the ghost dance, nervous authorities attempt to arrest Sitting Bull, leading to his death. Fleeing Sioux are pursued by cavalry and massacred at Wounded Knee Creek, with soldiers killing at least 150 and possibly as many as 300 men, women, and children, many shot while trying to surrender. As the 19th century ends, America's attention turns increasingly outward. The closing of the frontier, announced by the Census Bureau in 1890, raises questions about where American energy and ambition will direct themselves now that continental expansion is complete. The Depression of the 1890s, the worst economic crisis the nation has yet faced, creates political instability and raises fears that overproduction and insufficient markets might lead to permanent economic stagnation unless foreign markets can be opened. The Spanish-American War of 1898 represents America's emergence as an imperial power. The conflict begins with American sympathy for Cuban rebels fighting for independence from Spain, inflamed by sensational newspaper coverage and the mysterious explosion of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor. Remember the Maine? To hell with Spain becomes the war cry, though whether the explosion was accident or sabotage, caused by Spain or by someone else, is never definitively determined. The war lasts only 10 weeks and is remarkably one-sided. Commodore George Dewey destroys the Spanish Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay without losing a single American life. American forces invade Cuba and, despite problems with logistics, supplies, and disease, defeat Spanish forces in battles at El Caney and San Juan Hill, where Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders gain fame. The Spanish Caribbean fleet is annihilated when it tries to escape Santiago Harbor. Spain sues for peace, ceding Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States and granting Cuba independence under American supervision. The acquisition of the Philippines proves controversial, sparking a debate about whether America should become a colonial power ruling over distant peoples without their consent. The Anti-Imperialist League, including figures like Mark Twain, William James, and Andrew Carnegie, argues that imperialism betrays American principles of self-government and consent of the governed. But imperialists, led by Theodore Roosevelt, Alfred Thayer Mahan, and Henry Cabot Lodge, argue that America must take its place among the great powers, that modern nations require colonies for markets and resources, that Anglo-Saxon peoples have a duty to civilize supposedly inferior races. The Senate narrowly approves the treaty acquiring the Philippines, but Filipino revolutionaries who had been fighting Spain now turn their weapons against their new American rulers. The Philippine-American War lasts from 1899 to 1902 officially, though insurgent resistance continues for years longer. American forces employ brutal tactics to suppress the rebellion, torture, burning villages, concentration camps, while Filipino guerrillas wage a savage resistance. Over 4,000 American soldiers die, along with perhaps 20,000 Filipino combatants and 200,000 Filipino civilians who perish from war, famine, and disease. The acquisition of overseas territories marks a turning point in American history, transforming the nation from a continental republic into a global empire. The open-door policy toward China, articulated by Secretary of State John Hay in 1899, asserts American interests in Asian markets without requiring territorial conquest. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, announced in 1904, claims the right to intervene in Latin American nations to prevent European intervention, making the Caribbean an American lake. The presidency of Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 to 1909 embodies this new assertive American role in world affairs. Roosevelt becomes president at age 42 when William McKinley is assassinated, making him the youngest president in American history. His energy and ambition seem boundless. He boxes with military aides, goes on wilderness expeditions, reads voraciously, writes books, and involves himself in every aspect of policy. Roosevelt's foreign policy follows the African proverb he often quotes, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He mediates the Russo-Japanese War, earning the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. He sends the Great White Fleet, 16 battleships painted white, on a cruise around the world to demonstrate American naval power. Most significantly, he orchestrates the construction of the Panama Canal, first supporting a Panamanian revolution against Colombia when Colombia refuses to grant canal rights on acceptable terms, then negotiating a treaty with the new Panamanian government that gives America control of a 10-mile-wide canal zone in perpetuity. The construction of the canal, from 1904 to 1914, represents one of the greatest engineering achievements in history. 50,000 workers battle heat, disease, landslides, and the immense technical challenges of cutting through mountains and building locks that can raise ships 85 feet above sea level. The conquest of yellow fever and malaria through mosquito control, led by Dr. William Gorgas, makes the project possible where a French attempt had failed in the 1880s. When the canal opens in August 1914, it cuts 8,000 miles off the journey from New York to San Francisco, transforms global trade patterns, and symbolizes American technological prowess and determination. Roosevelt's domestic policy is equally energetic. He becomes the first president to seriously challenge the power of big business, using the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies like Northern Securities Company, the railroad trust organized by J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill. He intervenes in the anthracite coal strike of 1902, threatening to seize the mines if operators refused to negotiate with the union, the first time a president sides with labor rather than automatically supporting management. He champions conservation, setting aside millions of acres as national forests, parks, and wildlife refuges, beginning the preservation of America's natural heritage for future generations. The Progressive Era, roughly from the 1890s through the 1910s, sees widespread reform efforts addressing the problems created by industrialization and urbanization. Muckraking journalists expose corruption in government and business. Ida Tarbell writes a devastating history of Standard Oil's predatory practices. Lincoln Steffens reveals the shame of the cities where political machines trade votes for favors. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, describes horrific conditions in meat-packing plants with such graphic detail that it leads to the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Women's suffrage advocates intensify their campaign for voting rights, building on decades of work by pioneers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. The movement combines moral arguments about women's inherent equality with practical arguments that women voters will support reforms in education, public health, and morality. State by state, Western states begin granting women the vote, Wyoming in 1890, Colorado in 1893, Utah and Idaho in 1896, creating momentum that eventually forces national action. Settlement houses like Hull House in Chicago, founded by Jane Addams, bring middle-class reformers into immigrant neighborhoods to provide education, healthcare, and social services while learning about the conditions immigrants face. The social gospel movement encourages churches to address poverty and injustice rather than focusing solely on individual salvation. Labor unions grow stronger despite fierce opposition, with the American Federation of Labor under Samuel Gompers organizing skilled craftsmen, while the Industrial Workers of the World, founded in 1905, seeks to organize all workers regardless of skill level into one big union to overthrow capitalism. Prohibition becomes a major reform cause, with the Anti-Saloon League and Women's Christian Temperance Union arguing that alcohol causes poverty, domestic violence, and moral degradation. Progressives see alcohol as both a personal vice and a social problem, linked to political corruption through saloons that serve as headquarters for urban political machines. The movement gained support from business owners who believe sober workers are more productive, from women who see alcohol as a threat to family stability, from nativists who associate drinking with immigrant cultures they wish to suppress. William Howard Taft's presidency from 1909 to 1913 continues Roosevelt's policies but without Roosevelt's charisma or political skill. Taft actually files more antitrust suits than Roosevelt, but his cautious temperament and legalistic approach make him seem less progressive. When Roosevelt, disappointed by his successor, challenges Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912 and loses, he bolts to form the Progressive or Bull Moose Party, splitting the Republican vote and ensuring the election of Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, a former professor and president of Princeton University, governor of New Jersey, brings intellectual brilliance and moral certainty to the presidency. His domestic program, The New Freedom, seeks to restore competition by breaking up monopolies and lowering tariffs. The Underwood Tariff of 1913 significantly reduces import duties while instituting the first income tax under the newly ratified 16th Amendment. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 creates a central banking system to provide stability and flexibility to the money supply. The Clayton Antitrust Act and creation of the Federal Trade Commission in 1914 strengthened government's ability to prevent anti-competitive practices. But Wilson's presidency is dominated by foreign affairs and ultimately by America's entry into the First World War. When war breaks out in Europe in August 1914, Americans overwhelmingly favor neutrality. The conflict seems to be another European power struggle with no clear implications for American interests. Wilson declares that America must be impartial in thought as well as in action, though true impartiality proves impossible given America's cultural, economic, and political ties to Britain and France. American neutrality is tested by German submarine warfare. Britain's naval blockade of Germany prevents American ships from trading with the Central Powers, but submarines attacking merchant ships carrying supplies to Britain threaten American lives and property. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, killing nearly 1,200 passengers including 128 Americans, outrages American opinion. Wilson protests vigorously, and Germany eventually agrees to restrict submarine warfare to avoid bringing America into the war. Wilson wins re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," but events soon make American neutrality impossible. In February 1917, Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare, gambling that they can starve Britain into submission before America can mobilize. The Zimmermann telegram, intercepted by British intelligence and revealed to Wilson in March, shows Germany offering to help Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if Mexico will ally with Germany against America. These provocations, combined with the Russian Revolution's overthrow of the Tsar and establishment of a provisional democratic government, allow Wilson to present the war as a conflict between democracy and autocracy. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war, arguing that the world must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, Congress complies, though 50 representatives and 6 senators vote no, including Jeannette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress, who declares, "I want to stand by my country, but I cannot vote for war." America's entry transforms the war, though not immediately. The nation must create an army almost from scratch, with only a tiny regular force and the National Guard available. The Selective Service Act, passed in May 1917, institutes conscription, eventually registering 24 million men and drafting nearly 3 million into service. Training camps spring up across the country, transforming civilians into soldiers, teaching men who have never been far from home to follow orders, march in formation, and kill efficiently. The mobilization of American resources is equally impressive. Bernard Baruch's War Industries Board coordinates industrial production, ensuring that factories produce what the military needs. Herbert Hoover's Food Administration encourages conservation and increases food production to feed American forces and Allied populations. The Railroad Administration takes control of the nation's railways to ensure efficient movement of troops and supplies. Liberty Loan drives sell billions of dollars in war bonds to finance the effort, with celebrities and community leaders urging citizens to demonstrate their patriotism by lending money to the government. The mobilization extends beyond economics into culture and thought. The Committee on Public Information, led by George Creel, wages an unprecedented propaganda campaign to build support for the war. 4-minute speakers deliver patriotic talks in movie theaters. Posters urge Americans to buy bonds, conserve food, report suspicious activity. Schools teach children to hate the Hun. German language instruction is banned. Sauerkraut becomes Liberty cabbage. Frankfurters become hot dogs. Dissent is suppressed with alarming efficiency. The Espionage Act of 1917 and Sedition Act of 1918 make it a crime to obstruct military recruitment or to express opinions disloyal to the government. Socialist leader Eugene V. Debs is sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving an anti-war speech. Over 1,500 people are arrested for sedition, often for expressing opinions that would clearly be protected free speech in peacetime. Mobs attack pacifists, German Americans, and anyone perceived as insufficiently patriotic. The war creates an atmosphere of fear and conformity that contradicts the democratic values America claims to be fighting for. American troops begin arriving in France in significant numbers by early 1918, coming ashore at the rate of 10,000 per day by summer. General John J. Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Force, resists Allied pressure to feed American troops piecemeal into French and British units, insisting on maintaining an independent American army. The Doughboys, as American soldiers are called, bring fresh manpower and morale to exhausted allies who have been fighting for nearly 4 years. American forces see serious combat beginning in May 1918, when they help stop the German spring offensive that threatens Paris. At Belleau in June, Marines fight German infantry in savage combat through woods and wheat fields, suffering 9,000 casualties but stopping the German advance and earning German respect for American fighting ability. At Château-Thierry, the 2nd Division helps stem the German tide. In September, 500,000 American troops participate in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest American military operation to that time, suffering over 120,000 casualties while helping break German resistance. The American contribution to Allied victory is significant but not decisive. The war is won primarily by the French and British armies that have borne the burden of fighting for over 4 years. But American intervention tips the balance, providing the manpower and resources that make German victory impossible and exhausting German will to continue. In November 1918, facing revolution at home and military collapse at the front, Germany agrees to an armistice. The armistice takes effect at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, bringing to an end the war that has killed over 9 million soldiers and 7 million civilians, devastated Europe, toppled empires, and transformed the world. Americans celebrate wildly, throwing ticker tape parades, dancing in the streets, believing that their intervention has brought permanent peace, that this has been the war to end all wars. Wilson travels to Europe for the Paris Peace Conference, the first American president to visit Europe while in office, receiving adulation from crowds who see him as a savior bringing the promise of a just and lasting peace. His 14 points, outlined in January 1918, offer a vision of a new world order based on self-determination of peoples, freedom of the seas, reduction of armaments, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But the peace conference reveals the gap between Wilson's idealism and the hard realities of international politics. France, having suffered immense casualties and destruction on its territory, demands harsh terms to ensure Germany can never threaten France again. Britain wants to preserve its empire and naval supremacy. Italy and Japan seek territorial gains promised in secret wartime treaties. Wilson compromises many of his principles to secure agreement for the League of Nations, accepting terms that impose crushing reparations on Germany, transfer German colonies to Allied control as League mandates, and redraw European borders in ways that create new grievances. The Treaty of Versailles that emerges satisfies no one completely and contains the seeds of future conflict. Germany is forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, lose territory to Poland, France, and Denmark, surrender its colonies, disarm almost completely, and pay reparations eventually set at $33 billion. These harsh terms create resentment in Germany while failing to provide France with the security it seeks, a combination that will contribute to the rise of Nazi Germany and the Second World War. Wilson returns to America expecting the Senate to ratify the treaty, but he faces determined opposition from Republicans led by Henry Cabot Lodge who object to the League of Nations covenant, fearing it will compromise American sovereignty and entangle the nation in European disputes. Wilson refuses to accept reservations to the treaty, believing that any changes will unravel the entire settlement. In September 1919, he embarks on a national speaking tour to build public support, but the exhausting effort causes him to suffer a severe stroke that leaves him partially paralyzed and largely incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. The Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles and League of Nations membership in November 1919 and again in March 1920. America, having helped win the war and shape the peace, withdraws from the international system it helped create, pursuing isolationism through the 1920s and 1930s with consequences that prove tragic when another world war erupts 20 years later. The immediate aftermath of the First World War brings social turmoil and political reaction. Soldiers returning home find not the grateful nation they expected but economic recession, labor unrest, and fear of radicalism. The Red Scare of 1919 to 1920 sees Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer conducting raids that arrest thousands of suspected radicals, often with little evidence and in violation of civil liberties. The fear of Bolshevism following the Russian Revolution creates hysteria that destroys civil discourse and leads to the deportation of hundreds of aliens for their political beliefs. Race riots erupt in dozens of cities during the Red Summer of 1919, as black veterans returning from fighting for democracy abroad demand equal rights at home and white Americans respond with violence. The worst riot occurs in Chicago, where a black teenager swimming in Lake Michigan drifts into waters informally reserved for whites and is stoned to death, triggering 5 days of violence that leaves 38 dead and over 500 injured. These riots demonstrate that the war to make the world safe for democracy has not made America safe for its black citizens. The 19th Amendment, ratified in August 1920, finally grants women the right to vote nationwide after decades of struggle. This triumph of the suffrage movement, coming just after the war, seems to validate the progressive belief that America is moving toward greater democracy and equality. But the 1920s will demonstrate that social progress is not linear, that periods of reform are often followed by reaction. Warren G. Harding wins the presidency in 1920 with a promise to return to normalcy, a word he invents to capture the desire for a return to simpler, quieter times. His administration, while personally honest in Harding's case, is riddled with corruption. The Teapot Dome scandal, involving the secret leasing of government oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes, symbolizes the era's moral laxity and the return of government-business cooperation after the progressive challenges to corporate power. Calvin Coolidge, who succeeds Harding after the president's sudden death in 1923, presides over an era of unprecedented prosperity and business dominance. The business of America is business, Coolidge declares, and his administration removes regulations, cuts taxes on the wealthy, and allows corporations free rein. The stock market soars, manufacturing output increases dramatically, new consumer goods like automobiles, radios, and electrical appliances transform daily life. The 1920s are called the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age, a time of cultural innovation and social change that challenges traditional values. F. Scott Fitzgerald captures the era's glittering surface and moral emptiness in The Great Gatsby. Ernest Hemingway writes spare, powerful prose about the lost generation of writers disillusioned by the war. The Harlem Renaissance sees an explosion of black cultural production, with writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, creating art that expresses both the pain of racism and the vitality of black culture. The automobile, mass-produced by Henry Ford using assembly line techniques, transforms American life more completely than any previous invention. Ford's Model T, priced low enough that ordinary workers can afford it, puts America on wheels, creating suburbs, highway systems, and a car culture that defines American identity. By 1929, 23 million automobiles crowd American roads, one for every 5 Americans, a level of car ownership that staggers European observers. Prohibition, enacted by the 18th Amendment in 1920, represents the Progressive era's last great reform, but it proves to be an unenforceable disaster. Rather than eliminating alcohol consumption, Prohibition drives it underground, creating enormous profits for organized crime. Al Capone in Chicago, Lucky Luciano in New York, and other gangsters build criminal empires on bootleg liquor, bribing police and politicians, murdering rivals, corrupting the legal system. Speakeasies flourish in every city, supplying illegal alcohol to customers who enjoy the thrill of breaking the law. The hypocrisy and violence Prohibition generates eventually convince Americans that the experiment has failed, leading to repeal by the 21st Amendment in 1933. The prosperity of the 20s rests on unstable foundations. Stock market speculation reaches manic levels, with people borrowing heavily to buy stocks they expect to keep rising forever. The agricultural sector, depressed throughout the decade as overproduction drives down crop prices, sees farm income fall while industrial workers prosper. Income inequality reaches extreme levels, with the wealthy enjoying enormous gains while workers' wages barely keep pace with productivity increases. International trade is hampered by high tariffs and war debt problems, with European nations struggling to pay debts to America while America refuses to buy European goods. The bubble bursts on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, when the stock market crashes, losing $28 billion in value in the following week. The crash triggers the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Banks fail by the thousands, wiping out depositors' savings. Businesses close, throwing millions out of work. By 1933, unemployment reaches 25%, with perhaps 13 million Americans jobless in a nation that provides no unemployment insurance, no welfare system, no safety net of any kind. The human suffering is immense and heartbreaking. Men who have worked all their lives selling apples on street corners or standing in bread lines feel their dignity stripped away. Families are evicted from homes they can no longer afford, living in shantytowns called Hoovervilles in bitter mockery of President Herbert Hoover, whose inadequate response to the crisis makes him a symbol of government failure. Young people ride the rails as hobos, searching for work that doesn't exist. Farmers watch helplessly as banks foreclose on land their families have worked for generations, as crop prices fall so low that burning corn for heat is cheaper than buying coal, as dust storms created by years of poor farming practices blacken the sky and bury fields under drifting soil. Hoover, a brilliant administrator who had organized food relief for Europe during and after the war, seems paralyzed by economic orthodoxy that insists government should not interfere in the economy. He believes that voluntary cooperation and local charity should address the crisis, that federal relief would undermine self-reliance and create dependence. His faith in business leaders to voluntarily maintain wages and employment proves tragically misplaced. His assurances that prosperity is just around the corner ring hollow as conditions worsen month after month. The election of 1932 becomes a referendum on Hoover's failed policies. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, governor of New York and distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, defeats Hoover in a landslide, carrying all but 6 states. Roosevelt promises a New Deal for the American people, though he provides few specifics during the campaign. But his confidence, his energy, his willingness to experiment provide hope to a desperate nation. Roosevelt's inauguration on March 4, 1933, comes at the crisis's nadir. Every bank in America is either closed or operating under restrictions, the financial system has effectively collapsed, and there is talk of social revolution or military dictatorship. Roosevelt's inaugural address acknowledges the crisis while radiating confidence. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he declares, and somehow his aristocratic optimism reaches people and begins to lift the national mood. The first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency see an explosion of legislative activity unmatched in American history. The Emergency Banking Act closes all banks, allows federal inspection, and reopens only those that are solvent, restoring public confidence in the banking system overnight. The Glass-Steagall Act separates commercial and investment banking and creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to guarantee bank deposits, ending the epidemic of bank runs. The Securities Act requires full disclosure for stock offerings, and the following year the Securities and Exchange Commission is created to regulate the stock market. The Civilian Conservation Corps puts young men to work planting trees, fighting erosion, building park facilities, combining unemployment relief with conservation. The Tennessee Valley Authority brings electricity and economic development to an impoverished region through a system of dams that provide flood control, hydroelectric power, and recreation. The Agricultural Adjustment Act pays farmers to reduce production, raising crop prices and farm income, though it controversially requires destroying crops and livestock while people go hungry. The National Industrial Recovery Act attempts to stabilize industry through codes governing wages, hours, and prices, though the Supreme Court later strikes it down as unconstitutional. Perhaps most importantly, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration provides direct cash assistance to states for distribution to the unemployed, breaking the taboo against federal welfare. Later programs like the Works Progress Administration and Public Works Administration employ millions building roads, bridges, schools, post offices, and other public infrastructure while also supporting artists, writers, and musicians. Social Security, passed in 1935, creates a system of old age pensions and unemployment insurance, establishing the principle that government has a responsibility to protect citizens from economic insecurity. The New Deal does not end the Depression, unemployment remains high throughout the 1930s, and only the massive mobilization for the Second World War finally restores full employment. But it provides relief to millions, reforms the economic system to prevent another crash, and most importantly, restores faith in democracy at a time when many nations are turning to fascism or communism as alternatives to failed capitalism. Roosevelt's New Deal faces fierce opposition from conservatives who see it as socialism, from business leaders who resent government regulation, from the Supreme Court which strikes down key programs as exceeding federal authority. But Roosevelt's political skill, his ability to explain complex policies in simple terms through his fireside chats on radio, and his genuine concern for ordinary people make him beloved by millions. He is re-elected in overwhelming landslides in 1936, 1940, and 1944, the only president to serve more than 2 terms. The New Deal transforms American government and society in ways that persist to the present. It establishes the principle that government has a responsibility to manage the economy and protect citizens from economic disaster. It creates a coalition of working-class voters, minorities, urban machines, and Southern whites that dominates American politics for 40 years. It begins the slow process of including Black Americans in the economic safety net, though Southern Democrats insist on provisions that exclude agricultural and domestic workers, categories that include most Black Southerners. But even as America struggles with domestic economic crisis, international threats are gathering that will eventually force the nation to abandon isolationism and assume a global role it has tried to avoid. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rises to power in 1933, promising to restore German greatness after the humiliations of Versailles. In Italy, Benito Mussolini has already established a fascist dictatorship. In Japan, military leaders gain control and pursue aggressive expansion in Asia. Roosevelt recognizes the growing threats but is constrained by powerful isolationist sentiment. The Neutrality Acts of the mid-1930s mandate that America remain impartial in foreign conflicts, prohibiting arms sales to belligerents. When Japan invades China in 1937, America protests but takes no action. When Hitler annexes Austria in 1938 and then dismembers Czechoslovakia after the Munich Conference, where Britain and France appease Hitler by giving him Czech territory, America watches from across the Atlantic. The Second World War begins in September 1939 when Hitler invades Poland, and Britain and France finally honor their commitments by declaring war on Germany. The German blitzkrieg overwhelms Poland in weeks, then in spring 1940 sweeps across Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The miracle of Dunkirk saves the British Army but leaves Britain alone facing the Nazi Juggernaut. Through the summer and fall of 1940, the Battle of Britain rages in the skies over England, with the Royal Air Force barely preventing a German invasion. Roosevelt wants to help Britain but faces political constraints from isolationists who insist that America must stay out of another European war. He pushes the limits of neutrality, trading 50 old destroyers for British bases in the Western Hemisphere, persuading Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act allowing him to provide military equipment to nations whose defense is vital to America. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declares, edging America closer to active involvement. The decision is taken out of his hands on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans. Roosevelt calls it a date which will live in infamy, and Congress declares war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. Germany and Italy honor their alliance with Japan by declaring war on America, and suddenly America finds itself fighting a two-ocean war against powerful, experienced enemies. The American mobilization for the Second World War dwarfs even the First World War effort. Industrial production shifts almost entirely to military purposes, with automobile factories building tanks and planes, shipyards launching vessels at an astonishing rate, women entering the workforce by the millions to replace men serving in the military. Rationing limits civilian access to sugar, coffee, gasoline, tires, meat, and countless other goods to ensure military supply. War bond drives raise enormous sums. 16 million Americans serve in the armed forces, drawing from every region, class, and ethnic group. The war's first year goes badly. Japan conquers the Philippines, forcing General Douglas MacArthur to evacuate to Australia, leaving American and Filipino troops on Bataan to surrender in the war's largest American capitulation. Japan takes Burma, threatening India, and pushes across the Pacific toward Australia. German U-boats sink merchant ships faster than they can be replaced, and Rommel's Africa Corps threatens Egypt and the Suez Canal. But American production and manpower gradually turn the tide. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 sinks 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and establishes American naval superiority in the Pacific. The landing in North Africa in November 1942 begins the liberation of Europe, followed by the invasion of Sicily and Italy in 1943. The brutal island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, pushes Japanese forces back toward their home islands. D-Day, June 6, 1944, sees the greatest amphibious invasion in history, with over 150,000 Allied troops storming the beaches of Normandy, France. The landings succeed despite fierce German resistance, and Allied forces break out of Normandy, liberate Paris, and push toward Germany. In the east, Soviet forces drive German armies back across the territory Hitler had conquered, exacting terrible revenge as they advance. The war in Europe ends on May 8, 1945, a week after Hitler commits suicide in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces close in. Germany surrenders unconditionally, its cities in ruins, its people devastated, its Nazi leadership to face trial for war crimes at Nuremberg. Europe lies shattered, with millions dead, economies destroyed, political systems collapsed, populations displaced. The Pacific War continues through the summer of 1945, with American forces preparing for an invasion of Japan that military planners estimate will cost 1 million American casualties and untold Japanese deaths. But President Harry Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt upon his death in April 1945, authorizes the use of a new weapon developed in secret by the Manhattan Project. On August 6, a single atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima, killing over 70,000 people instantly and ultimately claiming over 140,000 lives. On August 9, another bomb obliterates Nagasaki. Japan surrenders on August 15, bringing the Second World War to an end. America emerges from the war transformed into a superpower unlike any the world has known. It possesses half the world's manufacturing capacity, 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, a monopoly on atomic weapons, and a military establishment of unprecedented power deployed globally. Yet Americans do not immediately grasp their nation's new position or the responsibilities that come with such overwhelming strength. Many expect to demobilize rapidly, bring the troops home, and return to normal life, as happened after the First World War. But the Cold War that develops between America and the Soviet Union makes such a return impossible. The wartime alliance between the capitalist democracy and the communist dictatorship dissolves as mutual suspicions and incompatible visions of the post-war order create tensions. The Soviets impose communist governments on the Eastern European nations their armies have liberated from Nazi control. The Americans, through the Marshall Plan, provide billions of dollars to rebuild Western Europe, not just from humanitarian motives but to create prosperous, stable democracies that will resist communist subversion. The Cold War becomes a global struggle between two superpowers and two ideologies, fought not through direct military conflict. The threat of nuclear annihilation makes that too dangerous, but through proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, economic competition, and the accumulation of allies. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 commits America to containing communist expansion wherever it threatens. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949, creates a permanent military alliance binding America to Western Europe's defense. The Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, sees American forces fighting to prevent communist North Korea from conquering South Korea, though the war ends in stalemate with the peninsula divided at roughly the same line where it started. The 1950s are remembered as a time of prosperity, conformity, and anxiety. The post-war economic boom puts America in a golden age, with rising wages, expanding suburbs, growing families, increasing consumerism. The GI Bill provides veterans with educational benefits and home loans, helping create a prosperous middle class. Television spreads rapidly, becoming the dominant medium for entertainment and information. Rock and roll emerges, with performers like Elvis Presley shocking parents and thrilling teenagers, creating a youth culture that challenges traditional values. But beneath the surface prosperity lies anxiety and fear. The Soviet Union develops atomic weapons in 1949 and hydrogen bombs in 1953, creating the threat of nuclear war that hangs over the era like a dark cloud. Civil defense drills teach schoolchildren to duck and cover under their desks in the event of nuclear attack, a gesture that provides psychological comfort but would be useless in actual war. Senator Joseph McCarthy leads witch hunts for communist infiltrators in government, Hollywood, and education, destroying careers and lives based on flimsy evidence and guilt by association. until his reckless accusations finally discredit him in 1954. The Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 declares that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal doctrine and beginning the legal dismantling of Jim Crow. But the decision meets fierce resistance in the South, with governors and legislatures vowing massive resistance, with white citizens' councils organizing to preserve segregation, with violence erupting when federal authority confronts state defiance. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 1956, triggered when Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat to a white passenger, demonstrates the power of nonviolent resistance and brings Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence. The boycott succeeds in desegregating Montgomery's buses, inspiring similar campaigns across the South. The Little Rock Nine, black students attempting to integrate Central High School in Arkansas in 1957, face such violent opposition that President Eisenhower must send federal troops to protect them, showing that federal authority will enforce Brown even against state resistance. The 1960s bring social upheaval and political turmoil that shatter the 50s surface calm. John F. Kennedy's election in 1960, the youngest president elected, the first Catholic, projecting youth and vigor, seems to herald a new era. His inaugural address challenges Americans to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. He proposes the Peace Corps to bring American volunteers to developing nations. He commits America to landing a man on the moon before the decade ends, galvanizing the space program that had fallen behind after the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957. But Kennedy's presidency is dominated by Cold War crises. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, when CIA-trained Cuban exiles attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro, humiliates the new president. The Berlin Wall, built in August 1961 to stop East Germans from fleeing to West Berlin, becomes a concrete symbol of communist oppression. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brings the world to the brink of nuclear war when American reconnaissance discovers Soviet missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world holds its breath as Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev negotiate, until the Soviets agree to remove the missiles in exchange for American pledges not to invade Cuba and to remove American missiles from Turkey. Kennedy's assassination on November 22, 1963, shocks the nation and the world. The murder of the young president in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald, and Oswald's subsequent murder by Jack Ruby on live television, create a trauma that haunts America for decades. Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, assumes the presidency and pledges to continue Kennedy's programs while adding his own ambitious agenda. Johnson's vision of the Great Society represents the most ambitious expansion of federal social programs since the New Deal. Medicare and Medicaid, passed in 1965, provide health care for the elderly and poor. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act provides federal funding to schools, particularly those serving low-income students. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlaws literacy tests and other devices used to prevent Black Americans from voting, and it authorizes federal oversight of elections in areas with histories of discrimination. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolishes the national origins quota system that had favored European immigration, opening America to immigrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The civil rights movement reaches its peak in the mid-60s, forcing America to confront the gap between its ideals and its practices. The Freedom Rides of 1961 test the desegregation of interstate transportation, with black and white activists riding buses together through the South, facing violent attacks from white mobs while police stand aside. The Birmingham Campaign of 1963 sees peaceful protesters attacked by police dogs and fire hoses, images broadcast on television that shocked the nation and the world. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail eloquently defends civil disobedience against unjust laws. The March on Washington in August 1963 brings 250,000 people to the nation's capital to demand jobs and freedom, culminating in King's "I Have a Dream" speech that articulates a vision of racial harmony and justice. The speech, delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, echoes the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation, calling America to fulfill its founding promises. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Freedom Summer of 1964 sees thousands of volunteers, many of them white college students from the North, travel to Mississippi to register black voters and establish freedom schools. The murder of 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, by a conspiracy involving local law enforcement shocks the nation and demonstrates the violence that underlies Southern resistance to racial equality. The Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965 dramatized the ongoing struggle for voting rights. When marchers attempt to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on March 7, state troopers attack them with clubs and tear gas in an assault so brutal that the day becomes known as Bloody Sunday. The violence, broadcast on national television, creates revulsion that helps push the Voting Rights Act through Congress. But as legal barriers fall, deeper issues of economic inequality, residential segregation, and persistent racism become more visible. The shift from Southern rural segregation to Northern urban problems challenges the civil rights movement's strategy of nonviolent protest and legal challenges. Riots erupt in Watts, Los Angeles in 1965, triggered by a traffic stop that escalates into 5 days of violence, leaving 34 dead and over 1,000 buildings damaged. Similar riots follow in Newark and Detroit in 1967, revealing the anger and frustration of black urban communities that have been promised equality but remain trapped in poverty and discrimination. The rise of Black Power, articulated by leaders like Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panther Party, challenges the integrationist vision of the mainstream civil rights movement, demanding not just legal equality but economic power, cultural pride, and self-determination. Malcolm X, before his assassination in 1965, offers a more militant alternative to King's nonviolence, arguing that Black Americans have the right to defend themselves by any means necessary. King himself evolves beyond the civil rights agenda to address broader issues of economic justice and opposition to the Vietnam War. His planned Poor People's Campaign seeks to unite people of all races in demanding economic justice. His speech against the Vietnam War in April 1967, delivered at Riverside Church in New York, declares that America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, linking the violence of war abroad to the violence of poverty and racism at home. His assassination on April 4, 1968, in Memphis, where he has gone to support striking sanitation workers, triggers riots in over 100 cities and robs the movement of its most eloquent and unifying voice. The Vietnam War, which escalates dramatically during Johnson's presidency, divides the nation more deeply than any issue since slavery. What begins as a limited commitment to prevent South Vietnam's fall to communist North Vietnam gradually expands into a major war with over 500,000 American troops deployed by 1968. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed in August 1964 after alleged North Vietnamese attacks on American destroyers, attacks that may not have occurred as reported, gives Johnson broad authority to wage war without a formal declaration. The war's conduct raises troubling questions about American power and morality. American forces employ massive firepower, dropping more bombs on Vietnam than were used in all of World War II, using napalm that burns through jungle and flesh, spraying Agent Orange to defoliate forests where guerrillas hide. Search and destroy missions seek to kill enemy forces while minimizing American casualties, but body counts become the primary measure of success, creating incentives to maximize enemy deaths regardless of whether the dead are actually combatants. The My Lai massacre in March 1968, where American soldiers kill over 300 Vietnamese civilians including women, children, and elderly people, exposes the war's brutality and the breakdown of military discipline. The anti-war movement grows from small protests by students and clergy into a mass movement that encompasses people from all walks of life. Teach-ins at universities educate students about the war's history and America's role. Draft card burnings symbolize refusal to participate in what protesters see as an immoral war. Major demonstrations bring hundreds of thousands to Washington to demand an end to the war. Young men flee to Canada or claim conscientious objector status to avoid the draft. Muhammad Ali, heavyweight boxing champion, refuses induction into the army, declaring, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," and is stripped of his title and banned from boxing during his prime years. The Tet Offensive in January 1968, when North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launch coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, fails militarily but succeeds politically by demonstrating that the war is far from won despite official optimism. The image of Viet Cong guerrillas fighting inside the American embassy compound in Saigon shocks Americans who have been told that victory is near. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newscaster in America, declares after visiting Vietnam that the war is unwinnable, leading Johnson to reportedly say, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Johnson, his presidency consumed by the war he cannot win and does not know how to end, announces in March 1968 that he will not seek re-election. His withdrawal throws the Democratic nomination race wide open. Robert Kennedy, former Attorney General and brother of the slain president, enters the race promising to end the war and heal the nation's divisions. But he too is assassinated, shot in Los Angeles on the night of his California primary victory in June 1968 by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian angry at Kennedy's support for Israel. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August 1968 becomes a scene of chaos and violence as anti-war protesters battle police in the streets outside while the convention nominates Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, who is tied to the administration's war policy. The riots and the party's bitter divisions help elect Richard Nixon, who promises to restore law and order and to end the war through peace with honor. Nixon's presidency embodies the contradictions and complexities of American power at its zenith. He pursues détente with the Soviet Union and opens relations with Communist China, traveling to Beijing in 1972 to meet with Mao Zedong in a diplomatic breakthrough that transforms the Cold War. He signs arms control agreements limiting nuclear weapons and anti-ballistic missile systems. He implements the Nixon Doctrine, declaring that America will provide military and economic assistance to allies but that they must provide their own troops for their defense, acknowledging the limits of American power after Vietnam. Yet Nixon also expands the Vietnam War, ordering secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos, invading Cambodia in 1970 to attack North Vietnamese sanctuaries, triggering massive protests including the Kent State shooting where National Guard troops kill 4 student protesters. The war drags on through Nixon's first term, with American forces gradually withdrawing while South Vietnamese forces take over more of the fighting. The Christmas bombing of Hanoi in December 1972, the most intensive bombing campaign of the war, forces North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, end direct American involvement in the war but leave North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam and postpone the final resolution. When North Vietnam launches a major offensive in 1975, Congress refuses to authorize military aid to South Vietnam, and the country collapses in weeks. The images of helicopters evacuating the last Americans from the embassy rooftop in Saigon as the city falls to communist forces symbolize America's first military defeat, a humiliation that raises profound questions about American power and purpose. Vietnam's legacy haunts America for decades. 58,000 Americans died in a war that accomplished nothing except demonstrating the limits of military power. Hundreds of thousands more return home with physical wounds, psychological trauma, and drug addictions, often receiving indifference or hostility rather than gratitude. The war divides America into those who served and those who avoided service, into those who supported the war and those who opposed it, divisions that persist into the present. The war undermines faith in government as revelations of official lies about the war's progress. The Pentagon Papers leaked by Daniel Ellsberg exposed the gap between public statements and private doubts. Watergate compounds this loss of faith in government. What begins as a burglary at Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex in June 1972 gradually reveals itself as part of a broader pattern of abuse of power by the Nixon administration. The cover-up, directed from the White House, unravels as reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of The Washington Post follow the story, as congressional investigations reveal the extent of wrongdoing, as White House tapes reveal Nixon's involvement in the cover-up. Nixon's resignation in August 1974, facing certain impeachment and removal from office, marks the first time a president has resigned. Gerald Ford, who became vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned over corruption charges unrelated to Watergate, assumes the presidency and immediately pardons Nixon, claiming the nation needs to move forward. The pardon is controversial but spares the country the spectacle of a former president on trial. The 1970s become a decade of malaise and self-doubt, as America struggles with economic problems, energy crises, and loss of confidence. The OPEC oil embargo of 1973, in retaliation for American support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, quadruples oil prices, creates gas lines, and reveals American dependence on foreign oil. Stagflation, the combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation, defies conventional economic wisdom and resists policy solutions. American industries face increasing competition from Japan and Germany, whose economies have recovered from wartime destruction to become formidable rivals. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, which overthrows the Shah, America's ally, and establishes an Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini, demonstrates the limits of American influence. The subsequent hostage crisis, when Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran and hold 52 Americans hostage for 444 days, humiliates America and contributes to President Jimmy Carter's defeat in the 1980 election. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 marks a conservative revolution that transforms American politics and society. Reagan promises to restore American confidence and power, to reduce the size and scope of government, to unleash free markets by cutting taxes and regulations, to rebuild American military strength to confront the Soviet Union. His sunny optimism and communication skills earn him the nickname the Great Communicator, and he connects with voters who are tired of malaise and ready to believe in American greatness again. Reagan's economic program, called supply-side economics by supporters and trickle-down economics by critics, dramatically cuts income tax rates particularly for the wealthy, arguing that this will stimulate economic growth that benefits everyone. The policy produces mixed results. Inflation is tamed, economic growth resumes after a severe recession in 1981 to 1982, but budget deficits explode as tax cuts are not matched by spending cuts, and inequality increases dramatically as the wealthy benefit disproportionately from tax cuts and deregulation. Reagan's foreign policy initially takes a hard line against the Soviet Union, which he calls an evil empire. The defense buildup includes controversial programs like the Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars by critics, which envisions a space-based missile defense system that most scientists consider impossible. The administration supports anti-communist forces around the world, including the Contras fighting Nicaragua's Sandinista government, Mujahideen resisting Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and various other groups regardless of their commitment to democracy or human rights. But when Mikhail Gorbachev becomes Soviet leader in 1985 and begins reforms called Glasnost and Perestroika, Reagan proves flexible enough to seize the opportunity for improved relations. The two leaders develop genuine rapport, signing major arms reduction agreements and beginning the process that will end the Cold War. When the Berlin Wall falls in November 1989, just months after Reagan leaves office, It symbolizes the collapse of Soviet communism and the triumph of Western democracy and capitalism, validating Reagan's confrontational approach in the eyes of his supporters. The end of the Cold War in 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolves peacefully, leaves America as the world's sole superpower, dominant militarily, economically, and culturally in ways unprecedented in history. The Gulf War of 1991, when President George H.W. Bush assembles an international coalition to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, demonstrates American military capability and willingness to use force to defend international order. The war is won in weeks with minimal American casualties, seeming to vindicate high-tech warfare and erase the Vietnam syndrome that had made Americans reluctant to use military force. The 1990s see America at the height of its power and prosperity. The economy booms as the information technology revolution creates new industries and transforms existing ones. The Internet, developed initially by the Defense Department and universities, becomes commercialized, connecting people and information globally. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, and Google emerge to dominate the digital economy. The stock market soars, particularly technology stocks, creating paper wealth that makes many feel prosperous even as inequality continues growing. Globalization accelerates as trade barriers fall, capital moves freely across borders, and supply chains span the globe. The North American Free Trade Agreement, implemented in 1994, creates a free trade zone linking America, Canada, and Mexico. China's integration into the global economy, particularly after joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, provides cheap manufactured goods to American consumers while hollowing out American manufacturing communities as factories relocate to take advantage of low Chinese wages. The optimism of the 90s ends abruptly on September 11, 2001, when terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes, flying 2 into the World Trade Center towers in New York, 1 into the Pentagon, and crashing the 4th in Pennsylvania after passengers resist. Nearly 3,000 people die in the attacks orchestrated by Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. The attacks shock America, which has not experienced such devastation on its soil since Pearl Harbor, and they transform American foreign policy and domestic life. President George W. Bush declares a global war on terror, vowing to make no distinction between terrorists and the nations that harbor them. The invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001, aimed at destroying Al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban regime that sheltered them, initially succeeds but becomes a 20-year quagmire that ends in failure with the Taliban's return to power in 2021. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified by claims that Saddam Hussein possesses weapons of mass destruction and supports terrorism, proves even more controversial as those justifications prove false and the occupation becomes a bloody insurgency that costs thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. The financial crisis of 2008, triggered by the collapse of the housing bubble and the failure of major financial institutions holding mortgage-backed securities, produces the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The government intervenes massively to prevent total economic collapse, bailing out banks and automakers, implementing stimulus spending, but the recovery is slow and uneven, benefiting the wealthy while leaving many workers behind. The crisis and its aftermath fuel populist anger at elites and establishment institutions that manifests in movements like the Tea Party on the right and Occupy Wall Street on the left. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 makes him America's first black president, a milestone that seems to validate the civil rights movement's achievements and America's progress toward racial equality. Obama's rhetoric of hope and change inspires millions, particularly young people and minorities. His signature achievement, the Affordable Care Act, extends health insurance to millions of previously uninsured Americans, though it falls short of the universal coverage many had hoped for. But Obama's presidency also reveals the persistence of racial divisions and the limits of presidential power in a polarized political system. The birther movement, falsely claiming Obama was not born in America, reveals the racism underlying much opposition to the first black president. The Republican Party, after suffering defeat in 2008, pursues a strategy of total opposition, refusing to compromise on any major legislation, using the filibuster to block nominees and bills, contributing to partisan gridlock that frustrates Obama's agenda and disillusions voters. The election of Donald Trump in 2016, defeating Hillary Clinton, who sought to become the first woman president, represents a revolt against the political establishment and a rejection of the globalization and cultural changes that have transformed America over recent decades. Trump, a real estate developer and reality television star with no government experience, campaigns on promises to build a wall on the Mexican border, ban Muslim immigration, repeal Obamacare, renegotiate trade deals, and make America great again. Trump's presidency is marked by controversy, norm-breaking, and fierce partisan divisions. His supporters see him as a necessary disruptor challenging a corrupt establishment, defending American workers against globalization, and standing up to China. His critics see him as authoritarian, corrupt, and incompetent, undermining democratic institutions, encouraging white nationalism, and damaging America's standing in the world. His response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which kills over 1 million Americans, is widely criticized as inadequate and confused. The 2020 election, conducted during the pandemic, sees Trump defeated by Joe Biden, Obama's vice president, who promises to restore normalcy and unite the country. But Trump refuses to concede, claiming without evidence that the election was stolen through fraud. His encouragement of his supporters culminates in the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol by a mob attempting to prevent Congress from certifying Biden's victory, a shocking assault on democratic processes that leads to Trump's second impeachment. And so we arrive at the present moment, with America's trajectory as the world's dominant power unclear. The nation possesses unmatched military capabilities, the world's largest economy, cultural influence that shapes global tastes and values, technological innovation that drives the digital age. Yet it also faces profound challenges. Growing inequality that threatens social cohesion, political polarization that makes governing difficult, racial divisions that persist despite decades of civil rights struggles, climate change that requires collective action difficult to achieve in a divided nation, competition from China that challenges American economic and technological dominance. The story of how America became a global juggernaut is not a simple tale of inevitable triumph or manifest destiny, but rather a complex narrative of ambition and idealism, violence and innovation, exploitation and opportunity, high principles often imperfectly applied. It is the story of enslaved Africans who built the plantation economy while denied freedom, of Native Americans whose land was taken and cultures destroyed, of immigrants who arrived seeking better lives and helped build a diverse nation, of workers who organized to demand fair treatment, of women who fought for equal rights, of reformers who challenged injustice, of soldiers who fought in wars both necessary and tragic, of inventors and entrepreneurs who created new technologies and industries, of artists and writers who explored what it means to be American. The journey from 13 struggling colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast to a nation spanning a continent and projecting power globally took 2.5 centuries, involving generations of people who could not imagine where their efforts would lead. The Jamestown colonists struggling to survive could not envision a nation of 330 million people. The founders declaring independence could not foresee that their experiment in republican government would endure for centuries and inspire democracies worldwide. The Civil War soldiers fighting to preserve the Union or end slavery could not imagine America as a superpower. The immigrants passing through Ellis Island seeking opportunity could not know that their descendants would land on the moon and invent the internet. The story is ongoing, with each generation inheriting the achievements and failings of those who came before, charged with addressing new challenges while preserving what is valuable from the past. The experiment that began with lofty words about equality and liberty, imperfectly realized but never abandoned as ideals, continues in the daily struggles to make those principles more real for more people. The power that America wields globally brings responsibilities that Americans still debate, when to intervene and when to remain aloof, how to promote democracy without imposing it, how to balance national interests with global needs, how to use strength wisely rather than arrogantly. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of America's rise is not the military victories or economic achievements, but rather the resilience of democratic institutions, the capacity for self-criticism and reform, the ability to absorb diverse peoples and cultures into a common identity while preserving diversity, the willingness to confront past wrongs and strive, however imperfectly, toward a more just society. The darkness in American history, slavery, genocide of native peoples, imperial adventures, racial oppression, economic exploitation, is real and must be acknowledged. Yet so too is the light, the abolitionists and civil rights activists who fought injustice, the labor organizers who demanded dignity for workers, the reformers who built systems to protect the vulnerable, the soldiers who defeated fascism, the innovators who imagined new possibilities and made them real. As you drift towards sleep, let these stories settle into your consciousness like sediment slowly accumulating on a riverbed. The voices of the past whisper across the centuries. Of enslaved people singing spirituals of sorrow and hope, of pioneers jolting westward in covered wagons seeking new lives, of factory workers demanding fair wages and decent conditions, of soldiers writing last letters home from distant battlefields, of immigrants gazing at the Statue of Liberty with tears of hope and relief, of protesters marching for civil rights singing, "We shall overcome," of astronauts looking back at Earth from space seeing a fragile blue marble in the vast darkness. The American story is ultimately a human story, with all the nobility and cruelty, wisdom and folly, courage and cowardice that mark human affairs. It is a story still being written, with the next chapters unknown, the outcome uncertain. The juggernaut that America became was built by millions of individuals making choices, taking risks, sacrificing, struggling, dreaming, each contributing in small or large ways to the vast collective enterprise of building a nation and shaping a world. Rest now, and let history's river flow gently past your consciousness. Let the weight of the present ease as you drift backward through time, touching these stories that connect us to those who came before, reminding us that we too are part of history's long arc. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and opportunities, but tonight belongs to reflection and rest, to the quiet contemplation of how we arrived at this moment, carrying within us the hopes and struggles of all who came before. The American experiment continues, imperfect and incomplete, yet enduring through crisis and change, always striving toward the ideals articulated at its founding, always falling short yet always reaching forward. In that striving, in that gap between ideal and reality, lies perhaps the deepest truth of the American story. Not that it achieved perfection, but that it never stopped trying, never abandoned the belief that tomorrow could be better than today, that the arc of history, though long, bends toward justice. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you are part of this ongoing story, connected to the past through memory and to the future through hope. The journey continues, as it always has, with each generation inheriting the world as it is and working to make it what it should be. The echoes of history fade into silence as consciousness dissolves into dreams, where past and present merge, where the American story becomes not just history but part of the landscape of sleep, woven into the fabric of rest and renewal. Good night, dear friend. May your dreams be gentle, may your rest be deep, may you wake refreshed and ready to write your own small chapter in the continuing story of this imperfect, striving, remarkable American experiment. The past is behind us, the future awaits, but this moment, this quiet moment of reflection and rest, belongs entirely to you. Sleep well.